Have you ever imagined waking up to a world where the sun still rises, but no longer feels alive? In the year 536 AD, people across Europe and Asia looked up and saw daylight turned pale, weak and wrong, as if the sky itself had been wounded. Crops began to fail, summers lost their warmth, and fear spread faster than any army. Historians still debate what caused it, but many now believe this was the beginning of one of the most devastating mysteries in human history. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because tonight we step into the year the sun disappeared. The first sign is not a battle, not a coronation, not the fall of a city wall, but a sky that no longer behaves like a sky. Morning comes, and yet it does not truly arrive. The sun rises, but its light seems thinned, blunted, as though some invisible hand has drawn a veil across the world. Shadows lose their edges, colours flatten. The land looks tired even at noon. People step outside and pause without fully understanding why they have paused. Something is wrong above them, and because it is above them, because it is everywhere, there's nowhere to stand apart from it. There are years in history that begin with a date. This one begins with a dimming. Before the strange light, the world of the early 6th century still carries the long afterglow of empires. Rome, in the old Western sense, is gone, but Rome as an idea remains stubbornly alive. In Constantinople, emperors still speak as if the Mediterranean is one world waiting to be governed properly again. Marble glows in church interiors, gold flickers in mosaics, ships cross familiar sea lanes with oil, wine, papyrus, grain, timber, silks, spices, and news. Messengers move along roads first laid down generations earlier. Tax collectors write in careful hands, priests preach, soldiers march. Farmers watch the weather with the seriousness that farmers always do, because grain does not care about theology or law or imperial ceremony. Grain cares about sun, warmth, rain, and time. Across Europe, the old imperial map has fractured into kingdoms that are young enough to be ambitious and insecure at the same time. In Italy, power sits uneasily on top of older Roman bones. In Gaul, new rulers inherit old cities. In Britain, post-Roman communities cluster among fading walls and working fields, living in a landscape where memory is longer than political stability. Farther north, beyond the formal frontiers of empire, societies tied to kin, land, trade, and warrior prestige follow rhythms that feel ancient and immediate at once. Their lives are not simple, only differently arranged. They know the sea, the forest, the cold, the cost of a poor harvest. They do not need an imperial historian to tell them when the world has shifted. Beyond the Mediterranean and northern Europe, the story is wider still. The East Roman Empire looks eastward toward Persia, toward frontiers where diplomacy and violence alternate with exhausting regularity. In South Asia, kingdoms rise and fragment. In China, dynasties contend with instability, regional fracture, and the immense burdens of governing rivers, frontiers, and granaries. On the steppe, mobility remains its own form of power. Trade routes carry more than goods. They carry rumour, infection, ideas, techniques, stories about distant rulers and stranger climates. The world of 536 is not modern, but it is connected enough that a shock in the air may not remain local for long. And yet, from ground level, most people do not live in a world historical panorama. They live in a village, a market town, a neighbourhood, a river valley, a coastal settlement that smells of fish and tar, a farm bounded by stone and memory. History, to them, is what the last winter was like. Whether the taxes will rise, whether the road is safe, whether the child with the fever will wake. Even in imperial capitals, daily life depends on systems that look stable only from a distance. Grain shipments must arrive, bakers must bake, water must flow, markets must open, the calendar must continue to mean something. Spring must feel like spring. Summer must ripen what spring began. That dependence on the ordinary makes the coming darkness so unnerving. Human beings can adapt to war with astonishing speed. They can learn the shape of occupation, defeat, tribute, new rulers, harsher laws. They can even absorb plague, though never without grief. But when the sky itself begins to misfire, the terms of life change at a deeper level. What survives in the record suggests that people do not merely notice unusual weather. They experience a disturbance in the logic of the world. Light is not just practical. It is moral, religious, agricultural, psychological. It structures prayer, labour, travel, timekeeping, and hope. When sunlight weakens, certainty weakens with it. The years before 536 are not peaceful in any full sense. Emperor Justinian sits in Constantinople with immense plans and immense confidence. He dreams of restoration, conquest, codified law, monumental building, imperial order. He rules a state that is rich by the standards of the age, but also stretched and vulnerable. Military campaigns cost money. Urban crowds are difficult to manage. Court politics remain treacherous. The memory of the Nika riots is still raw. Entire districts of the capital have recently known fire and terror. Hagia Sophia rises in astonishing scale, a proclamation in stone and light that empire is not merely enduring but ascending. There is grandeur in this moment, but grandeur often coexists with fragility so closely that contemporaries can mistake one for the other. Elsewhere, societies are also balanced between resilience and exposure. A few good harvests can make a kingdom look strong. A few bad ones can strip away the illusion. Climatic stability is one of history's quiet foundations. It does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be regular enough that planting follows expectation, grazing follows pasture, and stored grain can bridge the bad years. Remove that regularity, and institutions suddenly reveal how much they relied on patterns nobody created and nobody controls. An emperor can command armies. He cannot command the sun. This is part of what makes 536 so haunting to modern historians and scientists. The year sits at the intersection of two kinds of evidence that rarely align neatly. On one side stand written observers, chroniclers, administrators, religious writers, later compilers, each with their own purpose, style, and limitations. On the other side stands the earth itself, ice cores, tree rings, buried particles, chemical traces, all the mute archives of climate and catastrophe. Neither record is complete. Scholars still debate details that matter greatly: the exact source of the dimming, the scale of the cooling, the sequence of events that followed, the degree to which one disaster flowed into another. No single explanation fully accounts for every piece of the puzzle. But the deeper mystery is not whether something happened. It is how something so vast could descend over so much of the world and leave behind a record that feels at once unmistakable and incomplete. There is a tendency, when looking back, to imagine the past as permanently dramatic. It is not. Most years do not announce themselves. They gather quietly, through small repetitions, lambing, sowing, tolling bells, ferry crossings, repair of roofs, the exchange of gossip, the slow work of grinding grain. The strange power of 536 lies partly in the way it interrupts that ordinary fabric. The crisis does not arrive first as a famous catastrophe with a name. It arrives as altered daylight, as muted brightness, as the uncanny sensation that noon resembles evening and warmth no longer follows the season properly. It begins in perception before it becomes explanation. For the people living through it, there is no immediate global theory. There cannot be a farmer in the Eastern Mediterranean, a monk in Italy, a court observer in the East, a community in Scandinavia, a household in northern China. None of them can see the whole map. They see their own sky. They note frost where it should not be, harvest delay where ripening should be underway, haze where clarity belongs. They compare this year to remembered years and find no match. That failure of comparison matters. Human beings endure hardship partly by placing it inside known patterns. This winter is harsher than that winter. This flood resembles the flood from long ago. But what happens when old comparisons fail? The evidence remains incomplete. Yet the surviving descriptions suggest disorientation as much as deprivation. People are not only cold, they are bewildered. And bewilderment spreads quickly in worlds shaped by religion, omen, prophecy, and the old habit of reading nature for meaning. The 6th century does not separate natural disaster from spiritual significance in the way a modern laboratory tries to do. A failing sun is not merely a meteorological anomaly. It may be judgment, warning, sign, correction, or cosmic disturbance. Even practical men, even experienced officials, live inside symbolic worlds. They count grain and troop numbers, but they also inhabit a universe saturated with providence. That does not make them irrational, it makes them human, and it reminds us that when the sky darkens, people do not only ask what is happening, they ask what it means. The great irony is that this dimming comes during an age often presented as transitional, as though it were merely a bridge between the classical world and the medieval one. Lived forward, however, it does not feel transitional. It feels immediate. Cities still function. Governments still claim continuity. Trade still moves. Ambition still burns. Knowledge survives in manuscripts, in schools, in law courts, in monasteries, in artisans' hands. The old world is not dead. The new world is not fully born. History is suspended between inheritance and reinvention. Then the light fails, and that suspended condition becomes far more precarious. Modern readers sometimes expect the past to collapse cleanly, with one date standing in for 1,000 local experiences. But collapse, when it comes, is usually granular. It is measured in smaller loaves, thinner livestock, delayed ships, anxious sermons, abandoned plots, weakened bodies, tighter state demands, more desperate migrations. The year 536 matters not simply because the sun seems to disappear behind a veil, but because that veil falls over an already stressed human landscape. A strong society may survive a climatic shock, a brittle one may shatter under it. Most societies are neither entirely strong nor entirely brittle. They are mixed, uneven, resilient in one place, exposed in another. The dim sky finds all the weak seams. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, what makes the story endure is that it never fully settled into the past. Even now, the event resists simplification. Was it a single volcanic eruption of enormous force, or the beginning of a cluster of eruptions? How far did the haze spread? How much cooling followed, and where was it worst? How many lives were altered not in dramatic death, but in subtle diminishment, poorer nutrition, weaker resistance to disease, failed recoveries, lost confidence, severed continuity? Historians can trace patterns, scientists can measure traces, yet between atmospheric chemistry and human fear, there remains a gap that no instrument can close completely. Still, there is one point on which the scattered evidence converges with unusual force. In or around 536, something extraordinary enters the atmosphere of the Northern Hemisphere, and perhaps beyond. It changes the quality of light, it disrupts seasons, it leaves fingerprints in natural records, it unsettles written observers from distant lands who do not know one another, yet appear to describe the same wounded sky. The world does not end. That is part of the horror. It continues. Fields are still ploughed, prayers are still said, armies still march, administrators still issue orders, ships still attempt their crossings. Life goes on beneath a dim sun, and because it goes on, the suffering can deepen quietly. So the story begins not with a ruined monument or a battlefield full of bones, but with a planet slipping into pallor. A civilization looks up and finds that the oldest certainty of all has become unreliable. The sun is still there, and yet not there as it should be. Day remains day only in the technical sense. Light arrives as though exhausted. Warmth withdraws. The ordinary world, which yesterday seemed solid enough to bear empire, faith, and memory, begins to feel provisional. The people living through it cannot know that later centuries will remember 536 as one of the strangest years in recorded history. They only know that the sky has changed, and that once the sky changes, everything below it becomes harder to trust. The dimming does not arrive everywhere as a single instant, like a curtain dropped on command. It settles, lingers, confuses, and then refuses to leave. At first, it might be mistaken for a run of bad weather, an odd season, a haze blown in from some distant fire. But weather normally changes its mind. Clouds break, winds clear the air, rain scrubs the sky clean. This does not. The veil remains. Day after day, light comes muted, as though strained through smoke or dirty glass. The sun is visible but weakened. It no longer dominates the heavens with the ordinary confidence of summer. It hangs there like a memory of itself. For a world that measures time partly by the movement of the sky, this is not a small irregularity. It unsettles the body as much as the mind. Morning labour begins under a dull brightness that never quite sharpens. Midday offers none of the expected force. Evening seems to arrive too early because the day never fully opened in the first place. In cities, streets that should gleam lie under a flat and colourless light. In the countryside, the field seems strangely quiet. Less because nature has fallen silent than because people are listening for signs they do not understand. The season continues on the calendar, but in the air it feels delayed, interrupted, misfired. Some of the most famous witnesses to this year leave only brief remarks, but their brevity gives them a peculiar power. They do not sound like poets inventing omens after the fact. They sound like people trying, with limited language, to describe something they have not seen before. What survives in the record suggests that the sun gives forth its light without brightness, like the moon, for much of the year. That image endures because it is both precise and unsettling. Everyone in the ancient world knows the difference between sunlight and moonlight. One nourishes crops, warms stone, drives shadows deep into the ground. The other belongs to gentler hours, reflective rather than life-giving. To say that the sun looks like the moon is to say that the world's great source of power has become pale and insufficient. And with that failure of sunlight comes something even stranger summer without conviction. The year advances, yet warmth does not follow properly. This is one of the reasons the event becomes more than a curiosity. An eerie sky might inspire fear or wonder, but a cold growing season reaches into every layer of survival. Fields depend not just on rain or dry conditions, but on accumulated heat, on the quiet arithmetic by which light and temperature draw grain upward from soil and eventually turn green life into edible seed. When that arithmetic breaks down, the consequences begin slowly enough to deceive. Plants germinate poorly or later than expected. Fruit forms weakly. Vines hesitate. Pastures give less. The world still appears to be functioning, but it is doing so below capacity, like a body moving through illness without yet collapsing. The people living through this do not know they are entering one of history's most studied environmental mysteries. They have no access to sulfur records trapped in Greenland ice, no chart of volcanic aerosols, no reconstructed temperature curves. Their evidence is immediate and local. The sun is wrong. The warmth is missing. The season is behaving like a damaged machine. And because there is no clear cause available to them, explanation rushes in from older and more intimate systems of meaning. Some likely read divine anger into the skies. Others may have suspected distant fires, celestial signs, or disruptions in the order established at creation. Scholars still debate how people in different regions interpreted the darkness, but the evidence remains incomplete, and in many cases what survives tells us more about educated writers than about ordinary villagers. Even so, it is not difficult to imagine the texture of those days glances upward, conversations cut short, calculations repeated, unease widening with each week the haze remains. In Constantinople, where the Imperial court concerns itself with law, diplomacy, war, and spectacle, the dim sky intrudes into the confidence of power. The capital is a city of ceremony, but also of bread, water, and supply. It shines because labour from far beyond its walls sustains it. Grain from the provinces, taxes from the countryside, ships crossing uncertain waters, administrators converting harvests into numbers and numbers into obligations. These are the hidden foundations of urban life. A failed sky threatens that chain at its beginning. Not immediately. Perhaps. The city does not starve at the first sign of atmospheric haze, but every large system is more vulnerable than it appears when the thing it depends on most becomes unreliable. Far from the imperial capital, the experience may be even more intimate. In a small farming settlement, the failure of sunlight cannot be kept at an administrative distance. It enters directly into the soil. The seed does not respond as it should. Livestock graze on thinner ground. Late frosts or unusual cold come where they do not belong. People who have spent their entire lives learning local weather patterns discover that their hard-earned instincts no longer guide them well enough. This may be one of the least visible but most important aspects of the crisis. Environmental knowledge is cumulative. It is built through repetition across generations. When the climate delivers something truly strange, that inherited knowledge loses some of its value, at least for a time. Experience, which usually protects, begins to fail. The darkness also has a psychological weight that written records can only partly preserve. Modern life is full of artificial light, indoor shelter, and abstract confidence in remote systems. The 6th century knows none of that insulation. Light governs action in a more absolute way. A dimmed sun is not simply disappointing weather, it alters the emotional architecture of the day. Interiors feel darker, travel becomes less inviting, distance seems longer beneath a pale sky. Even religious ritual may feel different when the natural symbolism of light is weakened overhead. Churches can blaze with lamps and candles, but candles remind people of darkness as much as they dispel it. The contrast between sacred interior light and exhausted daylight outside may only sharpen the sense that the world itself is impaired. There is another feature of the year that deepens the mystery. This is not a momentary eclipse. Ancient people know eclipses. They know comets, unusual halos, strange seasonal storms, and the frightening but temporary spectacles of the sky. What makes 536 exceptional is duration. Weeks stretch into months. The persistence of the dimming turns alarm into endurance. Endurance is harder than panic. Panic consumes itself quickly. Endurance requires storage, explanation, patience, and luck. As the strange light continues, attention shifts from astonishment to calculation. Can the crop still recover? Will the weather normalize? How much grain remains from previous harvests? Which neighbors can be relied upon? Which authorities will reduce burdens? And which will demand more? The record does not preserve enough voices from below to answer those questions directly, but the broad outlines are clear enough. A year of dim sunlight is never only about the sky. It becomes a test of granaries, trade routes, taxation systems, elite generosity, local solidarity, and the bodily reserves of the poor. Well-fed households have margins. Thin households do not. A bad year falls unequally. And this inequality may be one reason why the event leaves such varied marks. Some regions seem merely strained, others appear shaken much more deeply. No single explanation fully accounts for this unevenness, because climate shock is filtered through political structures, geography, crop choices, storage capacity, and prior weakness. The same haze above two different communities may produce very different human outcomes. The strange sun also disrupts assumptions about distance. In ordinary times, people can treat faraway places as background. A war on another frontier, a flood in another valley, a famine in another kingdom, these matter, but indirectly, during the dimming, however, the local sky begins to suggest that whatever has gone wrong is not local at all. If the haze persists over broad territories, if similar reports emerge from distant provinces, then the event slips beyond the familiar scale of explanation. That widening scale may itself be part of why the year acquires such a reputation among later historians. It is not simply severe, it is large. The world seems to have been touched all at once by something impersonal and immense, and yet the evidence remains frustratingly fragmentary. Many records from the 6th century are sparse, lost, or filtered through later copying. A chronicler may compress a year's anxiety into a single sentence. Another may ignore the atmospheric event entirely because his interest lies elsewhere. Silence in the sources does not necessarily mean the absence of suffering. It may mean only that many who endured the crisis left no written account, or that their words never survived. This is where the mystery begins to sharpen. The event is both visible and obscured. It announces itself strongly enough to echo through distant texts, but not fully enough to let historians reconstruct every local experience with confidence. In the absence of certainty, the imagination can run too far. Later centuries love grand explanations. They look back and try to make 536 into a dramatic hinge, a single year that breaks the old world cleanly in half. But history is rarely so clean. The dimming is real, Its effects are serious. But the world it touches is already full of tensions, war, taxation, migration, ecological variation, political instability, and the ordinary precarity of pre-modern life. The darkened sun does not create fragility from nothing. It exposes and amplifies what is already there. That may be more disturbing than a simple disaster narrative. Catastrophe does not descend onto a stable stage. It merges with existing weakness until cause and consequence are difficult to separate. Still, for those living under the haze, explanation matters less than sensation. The fields are colder than they should be. The light is poorer than it should be. Time itself feels altered. Summer arrives dressed as something weaker and more uncertain. In marketplaces and monasteries, in ports and upland farms, in imperial corridors and rough village tracks. The same instinct keeps drawing eyes upward. The source of life remains present, but its power is muffled. No army can fight that. No law can correct it. No prayer, however sincere, guarantees that tomorrow's dawn will look normal again. What makes this year unforgettable is the way it teaches dependence through subtraction. Most people do not think daily about how much civilization depends on the invisible regularities on the angle of the sun, on the timing of warmth, on the trust that seeds will answer the season as they did before. In 536, those regularities begin to fail in public view. The failure is not dramatic enough to end the world in one blow. It is subtler and therefore in some ways crueler. It lets life continue while quietly reducing the margin for error. And once those margins shrink, every other hardship grows larger, politics becomes harsher, hunger becomes more dangerous, disease finds weaker bodies, fear finds better soil. So the year moves forward beneath a sun that shines and does not shine, present in form but diminished in force. The sky remains the same sky, yet its meaning has changed. What should be reliable now feels provisional. What should nourish now merely glows. And as the months lengthen, the dimness stops feeling like an anomaly and starts feeling like a condition. That is when the true weight of the mystery settles in. A strange morning can be dismissed. A strange season cannot. By the time people understand that the veil is not lifting soon, the question is no longer whether something unusual has happened. The question is how much of the world below that darkened light will be altered before brightness returns. By the time the first shock of the dimmed sun begins to dull into routine, another realization takes its place, and it is more dangerous because it is practical. The strange light is not only unsettling to look at, it is beginning to interfere with the machinery of survival. A poor sunrise can be endured, a poor harvest cannot, and now, across fields, orchards, vineyards, and pastures, the year starts to reveal what a wounded atmosphere means when translated into food. Agricultural life in the 6th century depends on timing so precise that it can look effortless only to those who do not have to live by it. Sowing, sprouting, grazing, flowering, ripening, cutting, storing, threshing, rationing. These are not separate rural tasks, but parts of one continuous chain. Break one link, and the strain carries forward into every link that follows. If spring is too cold, germination is uneven. If summer lacks heat, grain heads form badly or fail to mature fully. If pasture growth slows, livestock enter the next season weaker. If hay yields fall, animals cannot be maintained through winter in the usual numbers. That in turn affects ploughing power, milk, meat, manure, transport, and the household reserve against harder times ahead. A year like 536 is not dangerous simply because it is colder or darker. It is dangerous because it interferes with the compound logic by which one season prepares the next. Tree ring evidence from many parts of the Northern Hemisphere suggests that the years around 536 mark one of the sharpest downturns in summer growth in the last 2 millennia. Trees are patient witnesses. They do not describe what they endure, but they register it in wood with a discipline no chronicler can match. Narrow rings point to stress, especially reduced warmth during the growing season. Ice cores, too, preserve hints that something entered the atmosphere at a scale large enough to alter climate well beyond a single region. Yet even with modern science, the exact local experience remains uneven. Some areas may have been hit with exceptional severity, others with less dramatic but still damaging change. Scholars still debate the precise geography of the cooling, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the wider pattern is difficult to dismiss. The climate of these years falters, and human beings living by field and herd feel the faltering in ways no theory can soften. Imagine a farmer inspecting grain in such a season. The sky has been wrong for months. The warmth arrives weakly, if at all. There may be mist or haze that does not behave like ordinary weather. The crop stands there, visible, and yet its promise feels doubtful. Heads are smaller than expected. Ripening comes late. Perhaps there is an untimely frost. Perhaps rain falls at the wrong moment. Perhaps the sun simply never gives enough force to finish what spring began. There is no single dramatic instant when the harvest fails. Instead, anxiety accumulates as possibility drains from the field. The farmer is not comparing this year to perfect abundance. He is comparing it to the rough but workable normality on which life depends, and the comparison is grim. This is where the crisis begins to move from atmosphere into society. Food systems in the ancient world are resilient in some ways and precarious in others. Communities store grain, states maintain supply structures, households diversify what they grow and gather. Local exchange can soften a bad patch here or there. But widespread harvest stress is different. When poor conditions stretch across broad territories, the ordinary safety nets stop functioning well. A village that might rely on nearby markets finds that those markets are strained too. A town that expects grain from surrounding countryside discovers that the countryside has less to spare. A capital that depends on tax surplus feels the pressure first as numbers and delays, then as price and unrest. The failure of heat also does strange things to seasonality itself. Time in agricultural societies is not purely abstract, it is embodied. People know where they are in the year by smell, sound, labour, flowering, animal behaviour, daylight, and the feel of air on skin. A cold summer disturbs that sensory order. Haymaking may be delayed, fruiting may disappoint, vines may appear sluggish or damaged in upland or northern zones where margins are already narrow. Even a modest temperature drop can matter enormously. What survives in the record suggests more than bad weather. It suggests a year in which familiar cues become unreliable, and when those cues fail, judgment becomes harder. Planting decisions, grazing patterns, storage calculations, and travel plans all become riskier because the world no longer behaves as expected. The social consequences do not arrive evenly. The wealthy may still eat, though less lavishly. Urban elites may feel shortage first as rising cost rather than immediate hunger. Monasteries with land holdings and stores may endure better than marginal households. Communities with mixed ecologies access to fishing, foraging, pastoral fallback, or diversified crops may prove more adaptable than those dependent on a narrow agricultural base. But the poor live closest to biological limits. A single failed or weakened harvest does not merely reduce comfort, It attacks the reserve that makes life survivable in bad years. If the grain store is smaller, if the animals are thinner, if seed grain must be consumed, then the next year begins already damaged. Catastrophe in pre-modern life often works this way, not as one blow, but as the erosion of recovery. There is also the problem of trust. Harvests are social as much as natural events. They shape obligation, taxation, charity, labour exchange, and political legitimacy. A ruler or landlord can seem tolerable in years of decent abundance and brutal in years of scarcity. If dues remain fixed while yields fall, resentment intensifies. If state extraction continues when local reserves are collapsing, communities may be pushed beyond what custom regards as bearable. The 6th century is not governed by uniform systems, but nearly everywhere power touches food. That means climatic shock has political consequences even before it becomes famine. It sharpens long-standing tensions between centre and periphery, tax collector and peasant, landowner and tenant, army demand and village endurance. The eerie quality of 536 lies partly in the mismatch between cause and effect. The cause, as later science will suggest, may have been atmospheric, perhaps volcanic and distant. The effects, however, are intimate: a weak loaf, a hungry child, a plough animal that does not make it through winter, a village that eats its seed grain, a monastery that receives more desperate petitioners, a merchant who finds transport riskier and less profitable, a city where bread becomes harder to secure. Large-scale environmental disturbances become real through small private losses. That is one reason the crisis can be both globally significant and locally underdescribed. Chroniclers may mention the darkened sun, but they do not record every reduced meal or every decision to slaughter an animal that should have been kept alive for breeding. Yet history is full of turning points made of such decisions. In some regions, cold seems to have arrived with exceptional force. Later traditions and scientific reconstructions suggest that the middle years of the 6th century brought not just dimness, but severe cooling episodes, harvest failures, and in places genuine famine. Scholars still debate how often written reports of famine reflect literal mass starvation versus rhetorical emphasis or localized crisis. Even so, no serious reading of the evidence leaves the period looking stable. The climate shock is substantial enough to be visible in both text and natural archive, and substantial enough to magnify vulnerability wherever resilience is already thin. There may also have been a perceptual cruelty in the fact that the sun never disappeared entirely. A world plunged into full darkness would be unimaginable, but it would at least be unmistakable. Instead, people lived beneath a compromise sky, one that offered enough light to continue labour while withholding enough heat to make that labour insecure. Fields could still be tended, crops could still be watched, livestock could still be driven. The ordinary duties of survival remained. But the confidence that those duties would yield their usual reward was gone. This is the sort of strain that wears down not only bodies but morale. Work becomes heavier when its outcome grows uncertain. And still, the year moves on. This may be the most haunting part of all. There is no pause in history while the atmosphere misbehaves. Imperial administrations continue their paperwork. Armies still require provisions. Merchants still weigh risk against profit. Local disputes still need settling. Religious festivals still mark sacred time, though under altered skies. The dimming does not suspend civilization. It forces civilization to continue under conditions it was not built to handle. That difference matters. Systems rarely fail only because of a single external shock. They fail because the shock arrives while the system is expected to maintain all its ordinary burdens. The human body, too, begins quietly to register the consequences. Poor harvests reduce calories. Worse nutrition reduces resilience. Resilience matters not only for surviving winter, but for resisting infection, recovering from illness, sustaining labour, bearing children, and enduring stress. A weakened population can continue functioning for some time, but at a cost that may only become visible later. This is one of the reasons historians are cautious about drawing straight lines from 536 to every later crisis. The evidence does not support simple monocausal narratives, yet it would be equally misleading to imagine that a year of climatic disruption passes cleanly out of the system once the sky brightens. Biological and economic effects linger. A bad season shadows the next one. An underfed child does not recover instantly when conditions improve. A diminished herd takes years to rebuild. There is a lesser-known dimension here as well. Climatic stress can alter landscapes in ways people notice without being able to explain. Wet grounds may stay colder longer. Alpine or northern snowlines may behave differently. River rhythms may shift subtly. Pasture quality may change. Forest growth may stall. These are not spectacular signs, but in a world tuned closely to land, they accumulate into the feeling that nature has become unreliable. The evidence remains incomplete, and local variation is immense, yet enough survives to suggest that 536 is not remembered simply because the sun looked strange. It is remembered because the strangeness reached down into earth, plant, animal, and body. So the cold summer becomes more than a meteorological curiosity. It becomes an assault on predictability. The calendar still says summer. The people still perform summer's labour. But the season refuses to deliver what summer is supposed to deliver. Grain does not trust the calendar. Vines do not obey imperial ambition. Sheep do not care about theological confidence. The weakened sun imposes its own terms, and all human planning must bend around them. By now the mystery is deepening rather than clearing. The sky remains wrong. The warmth remains insufficient. The food system begins to show strain, and because no one living through it can see the event at a planetary scale, they are left with the most difficult kind of crisis, one that is undeniable in effect but obscure in origin. They know what is missing. They do not know why. They know the world has become harder. They do not know for how long. And as the harvest season reveals the full cost of a summer without heat, the darkened sun begins to look less like a sign and more like a verdict, one written not in prophecy, but in failing grain. As the dimness lingers and the failed warmth begins to show itself in the fields, the sense of isolation that often defines ancient suffering starts to weaken. This is not because the people of 536 suddenly understand the event in modern global terms. They do not, but enough observers in enough distant places leave behind fragments of testimony that, centuries later, a pattern begins to emerge from the scattered record. The same year that feels uncanny in the Mediterranean seems strange elsewhere too. The same wounded light, the same damaged season, the same feeling that something has gone wrong above the ordinary reach of politics and war, appears across lands separated by language, religion, and empire. That convergence is one of the reasons 536 remains so compelling. A local disaster can be tragic. A shared atmospheric disturbance stretching across much of the known world becomes something colder and harder to explain. The Mediterranean sources are among the most often quoted, not because they are necessarily the most complete, but because they preserve a tone of baffled directness. Writers associated with the late Roman world describe a sun that gives light without brightness, a year in which daytime itself seems diminished. They do not all use the same words, and not all of them are equally careful observers. Yet the consistency is difficult to ignore. The image of the sun resembling the moon is especially revealing. It does not merely suggest darkness, it suggests a reduction in quality, a strange spectral weakening. The sun is still present, but its nature appears altered. For people shaped by the long Mediterranean confidence in solar order, this is no small deviation. It is a breach in one of the oldest assumptions human beings make about the world. These Mediterranean observers are not writing from a single shared mood. Some are concerned with imperial events, some with church history, some with chronicle-style notation. Their agendas differ, their rhetorical habits differ. That matters, because historians must always ask whether a description is literal, moralized, or stylized by convention. Scholars still debate how much weight should be placed on any one source in isolation. The evidence remains incomplete, and no responsible reading turns every ominous phrase into a precise measurement. Yet when several writers, working from different corners of the late antique world, all pause long enough to note the same extraordinary dimming, their testimony begins to reinforce rather than merely repeat itself. North of the Mediterranean, the written record is thinner, but that thinness can be deceptive. A lack of surviving text does not mean a lack of experience. In many parts of northern Europe, the 6th century leaves fewer detailed written observations because literacy is less widespread and preservation is poorer, not because the sky behaves normally there. Indeed, some of the most intriguing clues from the north come not from chronicles, but from archaeology and later cultural echoes. There are signs of disruption, signs that communities may have faced acute stress, signs that the period was remembered as more than an ordinary bad year. None of this allows for easy certainty. No single explanation fully accounts for every northern pattern. Still, what survives in the record suggests that the darkened years may have bitten especially hard in places already close to climatic limits. The farther north one goes, the more a short growing season matters. In such environments, a reduction in summer warmth is not merely inconvenient. It can become existential. A modest cooling in the eastern Mediterranean might damage harvests. In Scandinavia or upland zones, the same cooling may push entire systems closer to failure. This is one reason historians are cautious about generalization. A single atmospheric veil may have a shared cause, but its consequences are unevenly distributed. Geography turns one sky into many different crises. What is eerie in one place may be disastrous in another. What becomes hunger in one region may become migration, abandonment, or long-term cultural stress elsewhere. Later traditions from the north have attracted enormous attention because some scholars suspect they preserve dim memories of environmental trauma. Stories of prolonged winters, broken suns, or a world slipping into unnatural cold have often been compared to the events of the mid-6th century. The comparison is tempting. It offers the possibility that a climatic shock was not only endured but absorbed into myth, transformed over generations into sacred or heroic narrative. Yet caution is essential here. Oral traditions are not weather reports. They evolve, compress, borrow, and reshape older material. Scholars still debate how much, if any, direct connection exists between 6th century climate stress and later northern mythic imagery. The idea is plausible in broad terms, but the evidence remains incomplete, and it is easy to force a modern reconstruction onto a poetic past. Even so, the persistence of these comparisons tells us something real. The event seems large enough that historians are willing to look for its echoes far beyond conventional chronicles. East Asia offers another crucial set of witnesses. Chinese historical writing, with its strong bureaucratic and courtly traditions of observation, sometimes records environmental anomalies with striking seriousness. Reports associated with the period mention unusual atmospheric conditions, summer frosts, crop damage, famine, and other signs that the season has gone badly wrong. These notices matter not only because they expand the map of the crisis, but because they come from a different documentary culture altogether. They are not Mediterranean authors sharing a regional language of omen and providence. They are observers working within another tradition of statecraft, cosmic interpretation, and record-keeping. When their accounts point toward cold summers, poor harvests, and atmospheric irregularity in roughly the same years, the cumulative force of the evidence increases. At the same time, East Asian records remind us that climate never strikes empty ground. Northern and southern China, frontier regions and core zones, court centres and rural populations all experience strain differently. Political instability, regional warfare, and existing economic pressures shape how environmental disruption is felt and remembered. A chronicle may note frost in summer, but behind that frost lie innumerable unrecorded stories, fields lost, granaries tested, roads carrying refugees, officials trying to interpret calamity within moral and administrative frameworks. As in the Mediterranean, the written record is both invaluable and incomplete. It preserves the event clearly enough to matter, but not fully enough to restore every local life touched by it. The importance of these East Asian observations lies partly in what they do to the scale of the mystery. Once the darkened years are visible not only in Mediterranean texts but also in Chinese historical records, the event begins to look less like a regional Mediterranean oddity and more like a hemispheric disturbance. That widening scale changes the kinds of explanation that become plausible. A local dust storm will not do, a single crop disease will not do, a moral allegory tied to one empire's sins will not do, at least not as a historical account. The witnesses do not prove a cause, but they constrain the field of serious possibilities. Whatever happened, it reached far. There are hints from other regions as well, though they are often less direct. Irish annals, later compiled and preserved through medieval traditions, may point toward failures of bread in the years that follow. Some Near Eastern sources speak of atmospheric or agricultural distress. These records must be handled carefully. Dating can be uncertain. Later compilation can distort sequence. Famine notices may reflect local conditions or broader ones. And not every hardship belongs to the same chain of events. Historians who work on this period learn quickly that accumulation of evidence is useful only when paired with discipline. Still, the pattern remains difficult to escape. Across multiple documentary worlds, something in the mid-6th century seems to have gone profoundly wrong with light, temperature, and harvest. One of the strangest features of these scattered witnesses is how often they combine precision with helplessness. They can tell us what seems to have happened. The sun dimmed, cold arrived out of season, crops suffered, hunger followed. But they cannot tell us why in any modern scientific sense. That gap between description and explanation is where the enduring power of the mystery lies. Ancient observers are close enough to the event to feel its immediacy, yet too far from our tools to decode its mechanism. Modern science, by contrast, is close to the mechanism but infinitely far from the lived sensation of standing under that altered sky. The historian's work is to move between those two distances without pretending they are the same. There is also a human intimacy in the fact that so many of these reports are brief, A sentence here, a notation there, a cold mention of famine or frost. Brevity can frustrate us because we want detail. We want landscapes, faces, exact temperatures, full diaries of fear. But brevity may be part of the event's truth. In times of recurring stress, people do not always write long reflections. They note what is necessary. They fold disaster into chronicle form because life leaves little room for expansive prose. A line about a sun without brightness may stand on top of months of anxiety, crop watching, prayer, and quiet dread. The smallness of the surviving record should not be mistaken for the smallness of the experience, and yet the witnesses also warn against overconfidence. It would be easy to smooth all these observations into one perfectly synchronized global catastrophe. History is rarely so neat. Different regions likely experience the haze and the cooling with different timing, different severity, and different combinations of secondary effects. Some areas may have escaped the worst, others may have suffered in ways no surviving text preserves. Scholars still debate chronology, causation, and regional variation because the evidence, though powerful, is not total. The record suggests connection, not uniformity. It suggests a shared atmospheric crisis, not a single identical lived reality. What emerges from these distant testimonies is therefore not a tidy narrative but a widening circle of recognition. The Mediterranean is not imagining it. Northern Europe is not alone in hardship. East Asia is not facing an isolated seasonal anomaly. Three very different worlds, and likely more beyond them, appear to look upward into the same damaged year. The realization matters because it turns 536 from a curious entry in a chronicle into something much larger. A historical moment when the sky itself becomes a common problem across civilizations that otherwise understand the world in sharply different ways. That shared problem does not produce shared solidarity. Of course, empires do not suddenly cooperate because the sun has dimmed. Kingdoms do not stop warring because crops are failing elsewhere too. But from the perspective of later centuries, these dispersed witnesses offer something rare. They allow us to glimpse the 6th century not merely as a patchwork of separate histories, but as a connected human landscape under a single atmospheric disturbance. Not one world politically, but one world physically, at least for a time. That may be the most modern feeling hidden inside this ancient mystery. So as the dim sky continues to hang over fields and cities, over monasteries and court compounds, over sea lanes and mountain valleys, the event acquires a new kind of gravity. It is no longer only a local terror or an imperial inconvenience. The testimony of far-flung observers begins, slowly and imperfectly, to converge. A darkened sun in the Mediterranean, strange cold and harvest failure in the north, summer frosts and scarcity in East Asia. The fragments do not explain themselves, but together they build the outline of a crisis too large to belong to one people alone. The 6th century, divided by culture and power, is briefly united by a broken sky. Once the strange sky has lasted long enough for people to stop hoping it will clear tomorrow, fear begins to take a more material form. It settles into granaries, markets, kitchens, monasteries, army depots, and the private calculations households make at the end of each day. The crisis is no longer only above them. It has entered the loaf, it has entered the price of grain. It has entered the question every community in the ancient world understand with painful clarity: how much food is there? And how long will it last? Hunger rarely arrives as a clean line between enough and nothing. It advances by subtraction. Meals shrink. Reserves once treated as untouchable begin to look negotiable. Seed grain is weighed against immediate need. Livestock are culled earlier than they should be. Families turn to foods that normally belong to worse seasons. The poor sell what little they have, then borrow, then endure. The wealthy notice first through inconvenience, then through cost, then through the growing instability of the people beneath them. In a world where most households live close to subsistence even in decent years, a damaged harvest does not need to fail completely to become dangerous. It only needs to fall far enough below expectation that the usual margin disappears. What survives in the record suggests exactly this kind of tightening. Notices of scarcity, crop failure, and famine appear in several traditions around the years after 536, though never with the neat consistency a modern historian would prefer. Some accounts speak plainly of want. Others mention bread failures or seasons so poor that the implication is obvious even when the word famine is not used. Scholars still debate the scale and geography of these shortages. A report of hunger in one source may reflect a local crisis rather than a continental one. Later compilers may compress several hard years into a single remembered disaster. No single explanation fully accounts for every mention of dearth. Yet taken together, the evidence points toward real and serious food stress spreading through regions already shaken by the weakened sun. The ancient economy has ways of absorbing bad years, but they depend on asymmetry. A shortfall in one district can be covered by imports from another. A city can draw from stored grain or state-managed supply. A monastery or elite estate can dispense charity and thus stabilize surrounding populations, at least temporarily. Merchants can redirect cargoes if routes remain open and profitable. But a broad climatic disturbance interferes with that flexibility. If too many regions are suffering at once, the places expected to send relief may be struggling themselves. Shortage then ceases to be a local emergency and becomes a systemic one. Not every province starves together, but the confidence that somewhere else has abundance begins to weaken. Markets reveal this faster than chronicles do. Prices respond before historians can name the pattern. When harvests are uncertain, grain becomes not merely food, but anxiety made measurable. Speculation increases, hoarding becomes more tempting. Authorities may intervene, but intervention has limits if underlying supply is truly falling. In large cities especially, the relationship between food and order is immediate. Bread is political. A capital can survive theological controversy, factional violence, and even military threats more easily than it can survive a sustained failure of provisioning. Urban populations depend on distance. They eat because ships arrive, caravans move, taxes are extracted, roads remain passable, and the countryside yields enough surplus to support people who do not grow their own grain. A dimmed sun attacks that arrangement at its root. For villagers and smallholders, the danger is more intimate. Hunger strips away abstraction. It changes the body first by fatigue, then by weakness, then by the narrowing of attention. Work becomes harder just as more work is needed. Decisions grow harsher. Which animal can be spared? Which child gets the larger portion? What tool can be sold? Which field can no longer be maintained? The documentary record is sparse on these household tragedies, but that sparsity is itself revealing. Most of those who suffer most leave behind the fewest words. Their experience survives indirectly, through larger notices of scarcity, through demographic stress glimpsed in archaeology, through legal adjustments, through the strained tone of institutions trying to manage a world with less food in it. There is also the moral dimension of famine, which ancient societies feel intensely. A failed harvest is never only an environmental fact, it becomes an argument about justice, piety, and power. Why has this happened? Who is to blame? Which sins, failures, or acts of arrogance have brought the world to this pass? In Christian lands, sermons and interpretations of calamity naturally gravitate toward divine judgment or chastisement. In other traditions too, disorder in nature is often read as a sign that human or political order has gone wrong. That reflex does not solve the shortage, but it shapes how communities endure it. Hunger becomes not just suffering, but meaning-laden suffering. Relief efforts, almsgiving, fasting, penitence, and public ritual all take on heightened significance in such conditions. At the same time, material desperation can corrode the moral order it is supposed to deepen. Charity has limits, so does obedience. If taxes continue at old levels while yields collapse, the moral standing of rulers deteriorates quickly. If granaries exist but appear inaccessible, resentment hardens. If elites remain insulated while common people slide toward starvation, the social contract thins to a dangerous transparency. What survives in the record suggests not one universal wave of rebellion, but a broader pattern of strained communities under pressure, institutions tested, and local inequalities made harder to ignore. Famine is never purely natural. It is mediated through power, and power is rarely distributed kindly. A lesser-known but crucial element in such crises is the destruction of the future. Seed grain consumed in one desperate season means poorer prospects in the next. Breeding animals slaughtered for immediate food reduce herd recovery for years. Families weakened by malnutrition cannot work fields at normal capacity when conditions improve. Debts contracted during scarcity can bind households long after the skies brighten. In this way, hunger is cumulative. It steals not only from the present but from the next harvest, the next generation, the next chance to stabilize. This is one reason the years after 536 matter so much. Even if the dimming had vanished quickly, its effects would not. Food crises leave long shadows. The atmosphere of fear during such years is difficult to reconstruct fully, but certain patterns are familiar across history. Rumour thrives. People search for signs that normality may return, and for explanations that make suffering feel legible. A late warm spell may raise fragile hope. A sudden frost may crush it again. Every shift in weather becomes charged with more meaning than it can bear. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet it is hard to imagine otherwise in communities whose lives depend so directly on season. Under such pressure, ordinary social friction intensifies. Theft becomes more likely. Migration becomes more tempting. Local disputes over access to land, storage, or transport sharpen. Even where outright famine does not occur, the fear of famine can reshape behavior dramatically. This fear may also help explain why the year 536 and its aftermath echo so strongly in later memory. People do not remember only what killed them. They remember what made the world feel unreliable. A darkened sky is terrifying, but it is still distant. Hunger is intimate. It enters the home, the market, the monastery gate, the body of a child. It strips away confidence in the next season. Once communities begin to understand that the sun's failure is becoming a food crisis, the event changes category. It is no longer a marvel, omen, or curiosity. It becomes a threat to continuity itself. Yet continuity, remarkably, does not vanish. This is one of the most sobering aspects of the 6th century. Even amid scarcity, people keep going. Fields are still planted when seed can be found. Trade still moves where roads remain open. Institutions improvise. households stretch reserves, religious communities provide what aid they can, states attempt to extract, manage, or redistribute. The world does not collapse everywhere at once. Instead, it grows harsher, thinner, and more brittle. Hunger becomes part of daily life in some places, looming possibility in others, remembered trauma in still others. The geography of suffering remains uneven, but the general pressure is unmistakable. It is possible, too, that some of the harshest stories have been lost. Archaeology can sometimes suggest population stress, abandonment, or altered settlement patterns, but it rarely gives us emotional texture. Written sources privilege the literate, the urban, the clerical, and the politically connected. They tell us when food was scarce, but only rarely what it felt like to watch a store jar empty faster than it should. Modern historians must resist inventing details that the evidence cannot support. At the same time, they must not allow the silences of the archive to flatten the human cost. When sources speak of famine, dearth, bread failure, or unseasonable cold, they are often standing above a submerged landscape of suffering much larger than the surviving text. This pressure on food and morale also begins to interact with everything else already underway in the 6th century. Wars do not pause for hunger. Ambitious rulers do not abandon campaigns simply because climate has become unstable. Tax obligations continue. Transport networks strain. Populations weakened by scarcity become more vulnerable to disease, though the exact chain from malnutrition to later epidemics remains debated. What matters here is not a simplistic cause and effect, but an accumulation of vulnerability. A darkened sky leads to poor growth. Poor growth leads to tighter food supply. Tighter food supply leads to weaker bodies and harsher politics. Each stage makes the next crisis more dangerous. And so the fear deepens. Not fear in the dramatic sense of constant panic, but something slower and more exhausting, the knowledge that the margin has gone. The household that once had enough to absorb a bad month now cannot absorb a bad week. The city that once trusted the countryside now watches its stores more nervously. The monastery that once offered help more freely must decide how much it can still spare. Under the pale residue of that wounded sun, ancient societies are beginning to learn the oldest lesson in the harshest way. Civilization rests on abundance so ordinary that people rarely notice it until it weakens. In the years after 536, that ordinary abundance begins to fail, and with it comes hunger, strain, and a fear more corrosive than spectacle, the fear that next season may not save them either. The darkened sky does not descend on a peaceful age. That matters because environmental shocks are rarely decisive by themselves. They become historically powerful when they strike societies already burdened by ambition, war, fragile logistics, and uneven reserves of trust. By the time the strange atmosphere of 536 begins to choke harvests and shrink margins, the Byzantine world is already attempting something enormous, the restoration of imperial power on a scale that depends on confidence, supply, taxation, and the assumption that the machinery of empire can keep functioning if pushed hard enough. Under Justinian, Constantinople does not think of itself as a wounded remnant. It thinks of itself as Rome still alive, Rome corrected, Rome expanding again. The dimmed sun arrives in the middle of that confidence like a flaw spreading through polished stone. Justinian's reign is one of the most striking in late antiquity, because it combines brilliance with overreach so completely that the two are difficult to separate. His government codifies Roman law in one of the great legal projects of history. His builders raise Hagia Sophia, a structure so audacious that even later centuries struggled to describe its interior without sounding overwhelmed. His generals recover territories in North Africa and Italy, briefly making the dream of imperial restoration look tangible. Yet every one of these triumphs depends on extraction. Armies must be paid, grain must move, horses, ships, weapons, labour, and tax revenue must continue to flow from provinces to centres of decision. A strong emperor can disguise strain for a time, but he cannot abolish the material basis of power, and that material basis, in the late 530s, is becoming less reliable. The empire that faces the darkened years is geographically impressive but structurally uneven. Egypt remains a crucial source of grain. The eastern provinces contribute wealth, manpower, and strategic depth. The Balkans are vulnerable to incursions and disruption. Italy, once recovered, proves more expensive to hold than to conquer. Frontier pressure from Persia does not disappear, simply because the emperor has Western ambitions. This is the reality behind imperial grandeur, a state permanently balancing multiple theatres, multiple enemies, multiple obligations. In good years that balance is difficult. In years of atmospheric dimming and harvest stress, it becomes far harder. A climatic shock does not need to shatter the empire immediately to matter politically. It only needs to make existing burdens more expensive and recovery more uncertain. If harvests weaken in several regions, tax collection becomes harsher or less effective, sometimes both at once. If food becomes scarcer, urban provisioning grows more fragile. If transport slows or costs rise, military operations become harder to sustain. If local populations are already near subsistence, imperial demands can tip hardship into resentment. Scholars still debate how directly the events of 536 affected specific fiscal or military decisions in Justinian's reign. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the empire's later difficulties. But it would be implausible to imagine that a broad climatic shock leaving marks in harvests, prices, and bodily resilience had no effect on a state trying to finance restoration across 3 continents. The Byzantine Empire is, in one sense, exceptionally capable. It has literate administration, tax structures, legal continuity, coinage, ports, professional military elements, and a capital city that acts as a nerve centre for information and command. These features give it a resilience many neighbouring powers do not possess. But administrative sophistication is not immunity. In fact, complexity can become a liability when every system is operating near its limit. A village can endure by simplifying. An empire cannot. It must maintain armies in the field, feed large cities, reward elites, negotiate with churches, repair fortifications, manage roads and shipping, and continue projecting authority. The dimmed years do not remove those obligations. They make them more difficult at the very moment Justinian is least willing to scale them down. In Italy, the empire's great Western theatre, war has already turned prosperity into exhaustion. Cities change hands. Countryside is stripped by marching armies. Fortified places survive while surrounding populations absorb the deeper cost. Recovered territory does not instantly become productive territory. Even before the environmental shocks of the late 530s and early 540s fully work themselves through society, the war zone is brittle. A bad climate does not simply add another hardship. It interacts with military devastation, disrupted trade, damaged irrigation, lost labour, and shaken local confidence. This is why historians increasingly resist clean separations between political and environmental history. for the people living through these years, a failing harvest, a tax demand, and a passing army are not distinct analytical categories. They are one reality pressing from different sides. The empire's neighbours and rivals are under similar pressure, though in different forms. The Sasanian Persian state, Justinian's great eastern counterpart, is no primitive antagonist waiting politely outside Roman history. It is a formidable imperial system of its own, with its own bureaucracy, military structures, fiscal demands, and environmental dependencies. Frontier warfare between Byzantium and Persia already consumes resources and attention long before the sky darkens. If broad climatic disruption affects harvests or local stability on either side of the frontier, then diplomacy, raiding, provisioning, and defensive planning all become more complex. What survives in the record does not always allow us to measure this precisely, but the larger logic is hard to escape. Two heavily organized empires facing one another across a contested border are both made less stable when nature withdraws cooperation. To the north and west, post-Roman kingdoms are also trying to build durable power on uncertain foundations. In Gaul, the Merovingian world is dynastic, martial, and regionally diverse, capable of impressive state-like action in some contexts and fragmentation in others. In Italy, Gothic rule had attempted to preserve Roman administrative habits even before Justinian's reconquest ripped the peninsula back into prolonged conflict. In Britain, political life is more localized and archaeologically elusive, but no less dependent on land, seasonal reliability, and interregional exchange. These worlds may appear peripheral from Constantinople, yet they too are exposed to the same basic problem: a reduction in climatic stability means a reduction in political room for error. One of the most revealing features of the 6th century is that rulers keep ruling as though momentum itself can overcome environmental strain. This is not irrational. Pre-modern states cannot easily pivot in the way modern bureaucracies sometimes pretend to do. Armies once mobilized cannot simply dissolve without consequence. Tax systems depend on precedent. Legitimacy depends on continuity. If anything, visible signs of instability may drive rulers to assert more control, not less. A dimmed sun does not encourage modest government. It may encourage harder extraction, sharper punishment, more desperate campaigning, or more pious public performance. Depending on the regime and the region, climate shock, in other words, does not only weaken states from the outside, it can pull them into choices that deepen internal strain. There is also a symbolic dimension to all this. Justinian's reign is full of claims about order, divine favour, legal restoration, sacred architecture, imperial mission. The emperor presents himself not merely as a warlord, but as a guardian of cosmic and earthly hierarchy. When the natural world itself becomes erratic, such claims become more difficult to inhabit comfortably. That does not mean subjects immediately blame the emperor for atmospheric dust veils. Pre-modern political theology is more complicated than that. But cosmic irregularity does disturb the emotional environment in which imperial authority operates. If the sun is dim, if famine spreads, if war continues, if taxes remain, then the grand promise of restored order begins to sound less like fulfilled destiny and more like insistence against the evidence. This tension between spectacle and strain may be one reason the age feels so dramatic in retrospect. Hagia Sophia rises under a damaged sky. Legal codification proceeds while harvests fail. Campaigns continue while communities are weakened by scarcity. The empire looks magnificent and overextended at once. The same reign that leaves some of late antiquity's greatest monuments also presides over years of deepening fragility. That is not a contradiction. It is often how power works. Monumentality can be a response to insecurity as much as a sign of confidence. The brighter the mosaic, the more one wonders what darkness outside it is trying to answer. Of course, the Byzantine world is not simply a victim of climate. It remains adaptive, creative, and often astonishingly durable. Provincial structures endure, local communities improvise, clergy, landowners, officials, and military commanders all participate in a complicated process of keeping society functional under worsening conditions. Some regions probably weather the crisis better than others. Some cities remain supplied, some estates remain productive, some campaigns still succeed. The point is not that 536 suddenly breaks the empire beyond repair. It is that the event arrives at a moment when success already depends on thin margins, and it makes those margins thinner. This is equally true beyond the imperial core. Neighbouring peoples, whether settled kingdoms or more mobile frontier groups, are not passive background figures in a Roman drama. They too are adapting to failed harvests, altered pasture, regional scarcity, and the changing opportunities that arise when large states are distracted or weakened. A climatic shock can rearrange the map indirectly by shifting the balance of resilience between different kinds of societies. Those with flexible subsistence strategies may endure better in one zone. Those dependent on concentrated extraction may suffer more in another. Scholars still debate these patterns in detail, because the evidence varies enormously from region to region. But the broader lesson is clear enough. The dimmed sun is not only an environmental event, it is a pressure test for political forms, and pressure tests reveal what ordinary times conceal. They show which regimes can redistribute effectively, which communities can absorb shortage, which military systems can keep moving when food is dear, which alliances break under stress, which ideologies continue to persuade, and which begin to ring hollow. Under the strange light that settles over the late 530s, empires and kingdoms alike are compelled to continue performing strength, while the natural foundation of that strength has begun to erode. So by now the mystery of 536 is no longer only about the sky or the harvest. It is about power under altered conditions. It is about a world of emperors, bishops, generals, landlords, and village households all trying to preserve continuity while the atmosphere itself refuses to cooperate. The sun has dimmed, and with it the assumptions that support expansion, recovery, and control. Yet armies still march, courts still legislate, priests still interpret. Grain still has to be found. The age does not stop being ambitious because nature has turned hostile. It becomes more dangerous precisely because ambition continues beneath a darkened sun. For centuries, the mystery of 536 survives in the same frustrating form: brief notices in old texts, hints of famine, references to a sun that seems to lose its strength, and the broad suspicion that something terrible happened without leaving behind a single clear signature. Historians can line up the written witnesses and feel the weight of their agreement, but written witnesses alone have limits. They exaggerate, compress, moralize, forget, and disappear. Entire provinces go silent. Entire classes of people never enter the record in the first place. If the story were left only to chroniclers, the year of the vanished sun might remain half legend, half puzzle, a dramatic cluster of anecdotes hovering on the edge of certainty. The real transformation in our understanding comes much later, when researchers begin to realize that the Earth keeps its own archive. Unlike manuscripts, natural archives are not interested in meaning. They do not care whether an emperor is pious, whether a famine is interpreted as judgment, or whether a chronicler is writing with flair or restraint. They simply register what passes through them. Snow falls in Greenland or Antarctica and traps tiny chemical traces from distant eruptions. Trees add a growth ring each year, wide in favourable conditions and narrow in bad ones. Sediments accumulate. Corals record ocean conditions. Peat bogs preserve pollen. Glaciers bury microscopic particles that can remain suspended in ice for more than 1,000 years. These are not narratives in the human sense, but they are records. Once scholars learn how to read them well, the darkness of 536 begins to acquire physical evidence. One of the most important breakthroughs comes from ice cores, in frozen sheets laid down year after year. Scientists can detect layers rich in sulfate and other materials associated with large volcanic eruptions. These layers are often tiny, invisible to the naked eye without close analysis, but they can be dated with remarkable precision. When researchers examine cores from Greenland and elsewhere, they find evidence consistent with a major volcanic event in the mid-530s, and then with additional volcanic activity in the years that follow. That does not instantly solve everything. Ice cores do not name the volcano. They do not tell us exactly how people in Italy or China felt as they looked at the sky. But they do something just as important. They confirm that the atmosphere really was disturbed on a scale large enough to leave a measurable chemical scar. This matters because it changes the status of the old written sources. The chroniclers are no longer standing alone, vulnerable to the suspicion that they merely embroidered a bad season into a cosmic drama. Their testimony begins to align with a completely different class of evidence, one generated without intention, preserved without human memory, and recovered without regard for literary tradition. A sun that gives light without brightness is no longer just a vivid phrase. It begins to look like a human description of a genuine atmospheric event. Tree rings deepen the case in many regions, especially across parts of the northern hemisphere. Trees show markedly reduced growth around 536 and in some of the years nearby. This pattern suggests unusual environmental stress, especially colder summer conditions. Trees are particularly valuable because they record the growing season directly. If summer warmth weakens enough to hinder growth, the ring laid down that year will often reflect it. When multiple tree ring series from different regions show downturns around the same period, the evidence becomes difficult to dismiss. Scholars still debate the exact scale of cooling and the regional variation involved, because not all trees respond identically, and not all places are affected in the same way. Even so, the broad picture is striking. The natural world appears to corroborate the sense that the middle of the 6th century saw a serious climatic disturbance. There is a quiet beauty in the way these different archives speak to one another. The chronicler notices the sun, the tree notices the cold, the glacier notices the particles in the air. None of them, on their own, tells the whole story. Together, they begin to form a composite image of a world under stress. This is one of the reasons the mystery of 536 has captured modern imagination so strongly. It is not only an ancient disaster, it is also a demonstration of how the planet remembers events long after human explanation has frayed. Yet the Earth's memory is not simple. Natural archives are powerful, but they do not produce certainty automatically. Ice core dating can be refined, but never without margins of interpretation. Sulfate spikes indicate eruptions, but not always their exact origin. Tree rings can reflect temperature, moisture, disease, or local ecological conditions as well as broader climatic trends. Sediment records may be influenced by multiple overlapping factors. Scientists must compare, cross-check, and argue, just as historians do with texts. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every observation. There is no one perfect layer of ice that says, in effect, this is why the sun dimmed over the Mediterranean in 536, and this is how every region responded. Nature preserves the event, but not in the tidy form of an answer key. Even so, the accumulated weight is extraordinary. Before these scientific methods matured, a historian might reasonably suspect that the old reports described an unusual but localized atmospheric haze, or perhaps a series of badly remembered seasonal anomalies. Now that is much harder to maintain. The combined evidence from ice cores and tree rings suggests a real climatic event of unusual magnitude, likely involving volcanic aerosols spread through the atmosphere, reducing incoming sunlight and cooling parts of the northern hemisphere. The phrase "the year the sun disappeared" remains poetic rather than literal, but it is no longer merely poetic. It points toward a material mechanism that can darken skies and wound growing seasons across vast distances. There are also lesser-known traces that enrich the picture. In some ice cores, researchers have searched not just for sulfate, but for microscopic volcanic glass, known as tephra, which can sometimes be matched chemically to specific eruptions. This is painstaking work, and often frustrating. A successful match can identify a volcanic source or at least narrow the field. An unsuccessful search still tells us something about the complexity of the event. The fact that the debate over sources continues is itself revealing. The signal is large enough to detect globally, but elusive enough that its exact origin remains contested. That combination of clarity and uncertainty is the signature of the entire 536 mystery. Another important insight from natural records is that 536 may not have stood alone. Evidence points not only to a major disturbance in the mid-530s, but to additional volcanic activity later in the decade or early 540s. This suggests that people living through the crisis may not have endured a single shocking year followed by straightforward recovery. They may have faced a sequence of climatic blows, each one arriving before the consequences of the last had fully faded. That possibility helps explain why the 6th century can feel so relentlessly grim in retrospect. The sky dims, harvests weaken, recovery begins to seem possible. Then another disruption arrives. The world does not simply fall into darkness once, it stumbles repeatedly. For historians, this scientific evidence has done more than solve a puzzle. It has changed the way the 6th century itself is understood. Political history alone once placed greatest emphasis on emperors, wars, laws, and theology. Environmental history now insists that atmosphere, climate, and disease must be placed alongside them, not as background scenery, but as active forces shaping events. This does not mean that volcanoes replace human decisions. Justinian still chooses war. Administrators still collect taxes. Communities still respond with varying degrees of resilience and cruelty. But the Earth's archive makes it harder to tell the story of the age as though nature were passive. The planet intervenes, and it leaves receipts. There is also something humbling in this shift. For a long time, written civilizations believed that what was not recorded in text was largely lost. The modern study of climate and environmental change has shown otherwise. Landscapes write too. Ice writes in chemistry. Trees write in wood, lakes write in sediment. The irony is almost perfect. A 6th century catastrophe that once seemed underdocumented now appears preserved in some of the most durable media on Earth. The people who feared the dimming could not have imagined that glaciers and pines would carry witness for them into a future 15 centuries away. Still, The scientific record does not dissolve the human mystery, it sharpens it. Once we know that the atmosphere truly was altered on a large scale, the old questions become harder, not easier. Which communities suffered most? How much of the later instability of the 6th century can reasonably be connected to climate, and how much belongs to war, governance, trade disruption, or sheer contingency? How should we weigh brief written notices against broad environmental signals? Scholars still debate these questions intensely, because the evidence, however impressive, does not eliminate interpretation. It provides constraints, not finality. Perhaps that is what makes the Earth's memory so haunting. It confirms the crisis but does not fully explain the lived experience of it. A narrow tree ring tells us that growth was poor, but not how it felt to stand in a failing field. A sulfate spike tells us that the sky was seeded with volcanic material, but not how a mother rationed grain, or how a priest explained the weakened sun to frightened worshippers. Natural archives make the mystery real beyond serious doubt. Yet they also preserve the distance between mechanism and meaning. So the story of 536 enters a new phase. The year is no longer suspended between rumour and record. The Earth itself has spoken, in the only language it knows: layers, rings, particles, residues. It remembers that the atmosphere changed. It remembers that the growing seasons faltered. It remembers, more reliably than any empire, that something immense moved through the sky and lingered there long enough to alter the terms of a life below. And because of that silent testimony, the old chroniclers look less like anxious men exaggerating a hard year, and more like the first stunned observers of a planetary event. Once the Earth begins to confirm that the sky of 536 was not an illusion, the search for a cause narrows dramatically. A dimmed sun lasting for months, cooling strong enough to scar tree growth, atmospheric residues preserved in ice across the far north. These are not the fingerprints of ordinary weather. They point towards something violent enough to push material high into the atmosphere, where it can spread far beyond the place of origin and remain long enough to weaken sunlight across a hemisphere. Among all the explanations proposed over the years, volcanic eruption has emerged as the leading one, not because it solves every problem cleanly, but because it explains more of the evidence than any serious alternative. The basic mechanism is simple, even if the event itself was anything but. A very large volcanic eruption can blast sulfur-rich gases high into the stratosphere. There, those gases convert into tiny sulfate aerosols that drift widely and reflect incoming sunlight back into space. The effect at ground level is not total darkness, but a thinning and whitening of light, a pale and altered sun, reduced surface temperatures, and a growing season weakened in exactly the way ancient observers seem to describe. The more material injected high into the atmosphere, and the higher it reaches, the broader and more persistent the climatic effect can become. This is why eruptions matter historically. They do not simply devastate the slopes of one mountain. Under the right conditions, they change skies continents away. Modern comparisons help, though only to a point. The eruption of Tambora in 1815, for example, is famous for helping produce the year without a summer in 1816 when cold, crop failure, and strange weather affected large parts of the northern hemisphere. It provides a useful model for how volcanic aerosols can disturb climate and agriculture at a global scale. But 536 may have been worse in some respects, or at least more complex. Scholars still debate whether the dimming that began then came from one exceptionally large eruption, or from a sequence of eruptions close enough together to behave like one prolonged atmospheric assault. Either way, volcanism remains the most compelling explanation because it fits the combination of written testimony, ice core chemistry, and tree ring stress better than competing theories do. That does not mean the case is fully closed. Identifying a volcanic cause is one question. Identifying the volcano is another. For years, researchers proposed different candidates, sometimes with great confidence, only for later evidence to complicate or weaken the case. Some look toward Iceland, partly because an eruption there could plausibly affect the North Atlantic and Europe quickly, and because high-latitude eruptions leave strong signals in Greenland ice. Others suggested more distant eruptions, including ones in the tropics, since tropical volcanic material can spread into both hemispheres and sometimes produce especially wide climatic effects. There have even been arguments for multiple eruptions in different regions, with the first dimming and later setbacks produced by separate events. Iceland has often drawn attention because of geography and plausibility. A major Icelandic eruption can send ash and sulfur into circulation patterns that influence northern skies dramatically. There is also something psychologically fitting about the idea a stark volcanic island at the edge of the known medieval world, seeding the atmosphere with the material that turns the sun into a ghost. But plausibility is not proof. Scholars still debate whether the chemical and tephra evidence securely points to Iceland for the 536 event itself, or whether another source better fits the available data. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single volcanic candidate commands universal agreement. This uncertainty is one reason the story has remained alive in both scientific and popular imagination. If the source were identified beyond doubt, the mystery would still be dramatic, but it would lose some of its tension. Instead, the leading explanation is powerful without being final. We know enough to say that volcanic aerosols almost certainly played a central role. We do not yet know enough to settle every detail about where, when, and in what sequence the eruptions occurred. That gap keeps the event poised between solution and enigma. There are, of course, other explanations that have been proposed over time. Some earlier writers suggested comet dust, meteor impacts, or unusual solar phenomena. These ideas have a certain appeal because they seem to match the cosmic eeriness of the ancient descriptions. A dimmed sun invites celestial speculation, yet most of these alternatives fare poorly when held against the combined evidence. An impact large enough to produce such widespread atmospheric effect should leave clearer geological traces. Changes in solar activity do not match the sulfate signatures found in ice cores. Cometary theories have struggled to explain both the physical data and the chronology. Scholars still discuss such ideas, especially in popular contexts, but within mainstream historical and scientific work, volcanism remains far stronger. Even within the volcanic explanation, though, there are layers of complication. One concerns ash versus sulfate. Ancient observers often describe the light as dim, but not necessarily as though they are living in dense falling ash over long periods. That distinction matters. In many cases, the most damaging global climatic effects come not from thick local ashfall, but from fine sulfate aerosols dispersed high in the atmosphere. These do not need to blanket the ground everywhere in visible dust. They can simply change the quality of the sky, whiten the sun, and cool the surface from above. This may help explain why written descriptions focus so strongly on altered brightness rather than on landscapes buried in volcanic debris. People are experiencing the aftermath of eruption, not necessarily the eruption itself. Another complication is timing. The written sources tend to cluster around 536 for the onset of the dimming, but natural records suggest that the broader climatic downturn extends beyond a single year. This has led many scholars to suspect that the 6th century's atmospheric crisis unfolded in phases. A major eruption around 536 could have triggered the initial darkening. Then another substantial eruption in the early 540s, perhaps around 540 or 541, could have renewed the cooling and deepened the stress before recovery had taken hold. What survives in the record suggests that people may have been trapped not by one disaster, but by repetition. That possibility is crucial, because it helps explain why the middle of the century feels so relentlessly punishing. The world is not struck once and then allowed to heal. It is struck, weakened, and then struck again. This layered model also fits the human experience better than a single neatly bounded catastrophe. If one eruption caused a dark year, communities might still hope for a return to normality after one failed harvest. If, instead, the climate remained unstable for years and was possibly worsened by additional eruptions, then fear would become chronic. Plans for recovery would repeatedly unravel. Seed reserves would remain thin. Herd rebuilding would slow. Bodies weakened by one season would face another. The atmosphere would not simply wound civilization, it would interfere with recovery itself. Volcanoes are especially effective historical destroyers because they act at a distance. A war has front lines, a plague has paths of contagion, a failed government has names and decrees attached to it. A major eruption can alter lives thousands of kilometers away among people who will never hear the mountain's name, never see its slopes, and never know that the grey light above them began as fire elsewhere. This distance gives the event its eerie impersonality. The 6th century experiences the consequences of an explosion that may have happened beyond its political imagination. An emperor in Constantinople, a monk in Italy, a farmer in Gaul, a court observer in China, all are living under the afterimage of a mountain they did not witness. There is also a broader lesson here about the fragility of human assumptions. Civilizations build their stories around visible agents, kings, armies, laws, gods, enemies. Yet some of the greatest turns in history begin with forces that have no interest in human narrative. Magma rises, pressure builds, a mountain fails, sulfur enters the stratosphere, sunlight weakens, and somewhere far away a crop does not ripen. The chain is impersonal, but its effects are painfully intimate. This is perhaps why 536 continues to unsettle modern readers. It reminds us that history is not only made by people looking at one another across borders or thrones, it is also made by the atmosphere. At the same time, one must be careful not to let the volcanic explanation become too complete in the imagination. Volcanoes may explain the dimmed sky, but they do not explain every consequence that followed. They do not automatically account for the exact scale of famine in every region, or the political choices states made under stress, or the different ways societies adapted or failed to adapt. No single explanation fully accounts for this entire period. Because causation in history is layered, a volcano may begin the crisis, but institutions, inequalities, geography, war, and luck determine much of what comes next. Still, of all the candidates proposed, volcanoes cast the longest and most convincing shadow across the evidence. They can make the sun appear weak, they can cool summers, they can leave sulfur in ice and stress in wood. They can strike far from the people who suffer their consequences. They can arrive without warning and outlast the season in which they erupt. Most of all, they can make ancient testimony sound suddenly modern. When a 6th century observer says the sun gave light without brightness, he may be describing, in the only language available to him, what stratospheric aerosols do to the world. So the mystery has sharpened again. The vanished sun was likely not an omen in the old sense, nor a supernatural interruption of nature, nor some celestial dust from the outer dark. It was probably nature itself at its most indifferent and far-reaching volcanic fire translated into atmospheric shadow. Yet because the source remains disputed, and the sequence may have involved more than one eruption, the explanation is still not a neat ending. It is a strong framework with open edges. Somewhere, perhaps in Iceland, perhaps elsewhere, perhaps in more than one place, the earth broke open with enough force to turn daylight thin and summer cold, and beneath that pale sky, ancient people endured the consequences long before anyone could know that the culprit might be a mountain hidden beyond their horizon. The volcanic explanation becomes even more unsettling once it stops looking singular. A single colossal eruption is frightening enough. It offers a dramatic image, one mountain tearing open and sending its aftermath across continents. But the deeper researchers look into the middle decades of the 6th century, the harder it is to believe that 536 was an isolated blow followed by straightforward recovery. The evidence increasingly suggests a sequence. One major atmospheric disruption in the mid-530s, then another substantial volcanic event a few years later, likely around 540 or 541, renewing the veil, extending the cooling, and trapping entire societies in a cycle of weakened harvests and deferred repair. If that reading is correct, then the real story of 536 is not one disaster, but a clustered assault on the stability of the age. This idea changes the emotional shape of the period. A single bad year can be survived with dread, improvisation, and hope. Human beings are remarkably good at surviving what they believe is temporary. They cut rations, postpone plans, consume reserves, pray for normal weather next season, and tell themselves that the worst has already happened. But when hardship comes in waves, recovery becomes its own casualty. The seed grains saved with such discipline may have to be consumed after all. Animals spared for breeding may still not rebuild the herd before the next shortage. Debts taken on in one bad season deepen in the next. Children underfed in one year are more fragile in the next. A society can survive the first shock only to be broken by the second. Not because the second is necessarily larger, but because it lands on weakened ground. The natural archives seem to point toward precisely this kind of sequence. Ice core data suggest a major sulfate signal around 536 and another in the early 540s. Tree ring records show severe growth suppression not only in the immediate aftermath of the first event, but across a broader interval, implying that environmental stress persisted or returned before normal conditions had properly reasserted themselves. Scholars still debate the dating details, the relative magnitude of each eruption, and the exact regional consequences. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single reconstruction commands universal agreement. Even so, the clustered model explains a great deal. It helps clarify why the 6th century's crisis feels prolonged rather than episodic, why famine notices and atmospheric anomalies do not sit neatly inside one calendar year, and why later generations may have remembered the period not as one bad season, but as a stretch of years in which the world itself seemed unreliable. This possibility also forces a more sober view of resilience. It is easy to celebrate survival in the abstract, but resilience has limits, and those limits are often temporal. A village can absorb one failed harvest by drawing down stores, leaning on kinship ties, or selling animals. It cannot do so indefinitely. An empire can cover one provisioning crisis by taxing harder, redirecting grain flows, or postponing expenditures. It cannot do that forever without political and social cost. A monastery can offer relief during one season of distress, but repeated scarcity can empty even pious generosity. The difference between catastrophe and survivable hardship often lies not only in severity, but in repetition. The 6th century may have crossed that threshold because nature did not strike once and withdraw. It may have kept returning. There is something especially cruel about repeated atmospheric shocks because they scramble memory and expectation. After the first dim year, communities would naturally watch the next sky with heightened attention. Perhaps this spring will feel normal. Perhaps this summer will be warmer. Perhaps this harvest will repair the damage of the last. Hope becomes part of survival. But if the atmosphere darkens again, or if cooling returns sharply before reserves recover, then hope itself becomes costly. People must continue planning, because not to plan is to surrender. Yet every plan is haunted by the possibility that nature will break it again. This is how prolonged crisis changes more than food supply. It changes the mental relation between humans and season. The clustered eruption model also helps explain why simple cause and effect stories feel inadequate. Historians once looked for one hinge event, one moment that could account for the age's hardship. But sequences are harder to narrate than singular shocks. A series of eruptions, followed by repeated cooling, followed by cascading social consequences, does not offer the clean drama of a lone cataclysm. It offers something more historically plausible and more disturbing attrition. The 6th century is worn down. Its people are not merely surprised, they are exhausted. Systems are not just damaged, they are denied time to mend. There may have been local experiences of this repetition that never reach the written record in any explicit way. A chronicler might note darkness one year and famine a few years later, without understanding that both belong to the same broad chain of atmospheric disruption. Villagers might not think in terms of volcanic clusters, of course, but they would understand recurrence. Another bad summer, another failed crop, another winter entered with less grain than one hoped, another year in which spring does not feel trustworthy. What survives in the record suggests that many people across different regions were forced into this pattern of repeated disappointment. That matters because disappointment, when sustained long enough, becomes structural. It reorganizes households, politics, and landscapes. Some regions would have suffered more from the second or third blow than from the first. This is another reason historians resist flattening the event into one global script. Geography, crop type, altitude, soil, storage practices, and political context all matter. A place that escaped the worst in 536 may have been hit harder by later cooling. A region with strong reserves during the first disruption may have found itself far more vulnerable by 540. Conversely, some communities may have recovered more quickly or benefited from local conditions that softened the impact. Scholars still debate these regional patterns because broad climate signals do not translate uniformly into local suffering, but the general principle is clear. Repeated environmental shocks widen inequality between places just as they do between households. The idea of clustered eruptions also reframes the meaning of the written witnesses. A chronicler describing the pale sun in 536 is not necessarily recounting the entirety of the crisis. He may be capturing only its opening. Later notices of scarcity, strange weather, or wider distress are not footnotes to the main event. They may be evidence that the main event was not finished. This makes the old sources both more powerful and more tragic. They are not isolated marvels scattered across a confusing century. They are fragments of a prolonged emergency that few observers could perceive in full. There is a scientific irony here as well. Modern readers often imagine natural disasters as singular moments, because that is how they appear in headlines and memory. A volcano erupts on a given date. An earthquake strikes at a specific hour. But climatic consequences do not obey that neatness. Atmospheric particles drift, settle, circulate, and interact with seasonality in ways that turn one eruption into years of altered conditions. Add a second eruption before the first disturbance has fully faded, and the calendar itself becomes misleading. The cause may happen in a day, the consequences inhabit a decade. This may be part of why some modern historians have described the years around the 530s and 540s as among the harshest of the Common Era. That phrasing can be useful, but it can also mislead if it encourages a taste for ranking suffering as though history were a competition in misery. The point is not that this decade can be declared universally the worst for every human being everywhere. The point is that a remarkable convergence of pressures appears to have taken shape: dimmed skies, cooling, harvest stress, scarcity, war, political strain, and soon enough something even more terrifying moving through already weakened societies. The clustered eruption model helps us see why the period feels so compressed with trouble. It was not merely unlucky, it may have been systematically battered. There is another, quieter consequence of repeated shocks: memory itself becomes blurred. People living through years of disruption do not always preserve them as separate events. One bad year spills into the next, and later recollection compresses them into an era of darkness, hunger, and instability. This may explain why later traditions sometimes carry the feel of prolonged winter or cosmic disorder rather than precise annual reporting. Human memory is better at preserving atmosphere than chronology. The 6th century may have been remembered as a time when the sun failed, not because it vanished literally for a single year, but because for several years its old reliability seemed gone. And perhaps that is the true weight of the clustered explanation. It replaces the image of one brief catastrophe with a more unsettling vision of suspended normality. The world does not collapse in a single convulsion. It enters a stretch of years in which recovery keeps being postponed. Empires remain intact on paper but are less secure in practice. Farms remain occupied but produce less. Trade still functions but under greater strain. Communities endure but with less margin, less confidence, and less capacity to absorb what comes next. So the mystery of 536 widens into the mystery of an entire wounded decade. One eruption may have dimmed the sun, another may have renewed the blow, the skies may have brightened unevenly, only to cloud again in climatic terms before people had rebuilt their lives. What seemed at first like a terrible anomaly begins to look like a series, a rhythm of interruption, and once that possibility enters the story, the age becomes harder to view as a collection of separate crises. It begins to resemble one long disturbance, with different symptoms appearing year after year beneath the sun that had not so much disappeared as lost the power to reassure. By the early 540s, the 6th century has already been weakened by years of atmospheric disturbance, poor harvests, and shrinking reserves when a new horror enters the record. It does not descend from the sky. It moves through ports, roads, storehouses, grain routes, and crowded settlements. It travels with fleas, with rodents, with ships, with commerce itself. Later generations will know it as the Justinianic plague, the first historically well-documented pandemic of bubonic plague. Its arrival does not erase the darkened years that came before. Instead, It seems to feed on the world those years have made thinner, harsher, and less able to resist what is coming. The pandemic appears in the reign of Justinian at almost the worst possible moment. Constantinople remains the glittering heart of an empire still committed to recovery and expansion, but it is also a dense urban machine tied to long-distance grain movement and maritime supply. Such cities are engines of power and vulnerability at once. They concentrate wealth, administration, religion, spectacle, and disease-bearing networks in the same space. A climate-shaken world can endure many blows before it breaks, but once epidemic disease begins moving through bodies already weakened by scarcity, through trade systems already under strain, and through populations living close together, the mathematics of survival change again. It is important to separate what is known from what is inferred here. Modern scholarship strongly supports the identification of the Justinianic plague with the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the same pathogen associated with the later Black Death. Ancient descriptions of swellings, fever, rapid death, and the broad pattern of spread long suggested plague, and genetic evidence recovered from some burials has reinforced that view. At the same time, many details remain debated. Scholars still dispute the precise mortality rates, the speed and extent of repeated recurrences, and the degree to which the pandemic transformed every region equally. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the variation in impact across the Mediterranean and beyond. Even so, few historians now doubt that the mid-6th century faced a serious plague event of exceptional scale. The old environmental mystery and the plague are not the same disaster, but they do belong to the same damaged landscape. A darkened sky does not cause plague in any direct, simple sense. Volcanoes do not create Yersinia pestis, yet the years after 536 may have made many societies more vulnerable to epidemic disease by narrowing food supply, weakening bodies, straining institutions, and disrupting patterns of stability. Malnutrition, or even just poorer average nutrition, does not need to be universal to matter. Bodies under chronic stress recover less well, resist infection less effectively, and carry the marks of scarcity in ways no chronicle can fully record. A population does not have to be starving to be less resilient. It only has to be somewhat diminished. There is also the question of movement. Climatic disruption can alter trade flows, local ecologies, and storage practices in ways that interact unpredictably with disease systems. Grain ships and warehouses are not merely economic infrastructure. They are habitats, passageways, and opportunities for rat populations and the fleas associated with them. Ports become more than commercial nodes. They become epidemiological gateways. Constantinople, with its dense population and dependence on imported grain, is particularly exposed. When plague arrives there, later accounts describe mortality on a scale that appears staggering, though exact numbers in such texts must always be treated cautiously. Ancient writers tend toward numerical inflation during catastrophe, not always out of deceit, but because the emotional truth of mass death is hard to represent without reaching for immense figures. Still, even allowing for exaggeration, the scale seems to have been severe. What makes the plague so devastating in narrative terms is not only the number of deaths, but the sequence in which it appears. Had it come in an age of agricultural abundance, political calm, and strong bodily reserves, its effects might still have been immense, but the societies facing it would have had more room to absorb the shock. Instead, it arrives in a decade already marked by dim skies, cooling, scarcity, and repeated stress. This is why the mid-6th century can feel so unnaturally compressed with suffering. One catastrophe does not replace the last. Each new one enters an environment shaped by the consequences of the ones before it. Ancient observers naturally interpret the plague through the moral and religious language available to them. They see divine judgment, chastisement, apocalyptic warning, or the inscrutable working of providence. That is not surprising. Disease on such a scale overwhelms ordinary categories. Bodies swell, fever rises, households empty, labour collapses, burials become difficult, and the routines of city and countryside alike are disfigured. The plague is experienced as both physical invasion and metaphysical breach. Yet alongside the language of judgment runs a more practical horror. People who must still bake bread, govern cities, move grain, maintain walls, treat the sick, or dispose of the dead discover that epidemic disease attacks function itself. It kills not only individuals, but timing, trust, and continuity. One of the most unsettling questions is how much climate may have shaped the plague's wider conditions of spread and persistence. Scholars still debate this carefully. Some have suggested that volcanic cooling and ecological disruption may have affected rodent populations, trade dynamics, or human vulnerability in ways that helped plague establish itself more successfully. Others warn against making the chain too neat. They are right to be cautious. The evidence does not allow a simplistic story in which volcanic eruptions automatically produce plague. Disease emergence and spread depend on ecology, hosts, vectors, trade, and contingency in ways that remain difficult to reconstruct. Still, what survives in the record suggests that the plague entered a world already less resilient than it had been a decade earlier. That alone matters. The consequences for empire are severe. Plague removes taxpayers, soldiers, sailors, labourers, mule drivers, dock workers, farmers, clergy, scribes, and craftsmen. It interrupts both production and administration. It weakens local communities while also weakening the state's capacity to extract from them. A war-making empire can survive a military defeat more easily than a sustained hollowing out of manpower and confidence across multiple sectors. Justinian's government continues to function, and the empire does not simply dissolve, but its room for manoeuvre narrows. The dream of restoration remains alive in ideology long after the material world sustaining it has become more precarious. And beyond the imperial core, the plague moves through other societies already carrying the burdens of the previous decade. Trade routes that once spread goods now spread fear. Communities forced to think constantly about food must now think about proximity, sickness, and burial. Religious life intensifies, but so do despair and exhaustion. A famine year can be survived through hard decisions. A plague year can make even those decisions irrelevant. It is one thing to have too little grain. It is another to lose the people who would plant, transport, mill, or distribute it. Once epidemic mortality enters the system, every existing weakness becomes more dangerous. There is a risk, in telling this story, of making the 6th century sound like an unstoppable avalanche of disaster. Reality is more uneven. Some communities no doubt escaped the worst of the plague, or faced it in waves rather than one total collapse. Some regions recovered more quickly. Some local economies adapted. The empire itself endured, which is perhaps the most remarkable fact of all. But endurance is not the same as health. A body can survive a fever and never return to its former strength. A state can survive environmental shock and pandemic and still emerge permanently altered. Poorer in capacity, harsher in extraction, narrower in ambition, and more vulnerable to what comes next. The plague also changes time. Climatic stress had already made people fear the future because harvests and seasons no longer behaved reliably. Pandemic adds another kind of uncertainty. The danger is no longer only whether the next crop will ripen, but whether the next ship will bring contagion, whether the next fever in the household is ordinary illness or something far worse, whether burial grounds will suffice, whether officials and clergy themselves will remain alive to carry out the tasks that hold society together. The darkened years had made the world feel unstable from above. Plague makes it unstable from within. This is one reason later historians so often bind these crises together, even when careful analysis separates them. The clustering is not only chronological, it is experiential. A generation that lives through dimmed suns, cold summers, hunger, and plague does not experience these as tidy categories in a textbook. It experiences them as a broad collapse of reliability. The sky fails, the harvest fails, the body fails. Institutions keep functioning, but with less grace, less excess, and less confidence. The world continues, but every layer of life feels more fragile than before. And still, life does continue. That may be the most sobering truth of the whole century. Even amid plague, ships still sail, courts still issue decrees, monasteries still pray, peasants still plant when they can, and rulers still imagine that order can be restored. Human societies do not surrender neatly, even under repeated blows. They persist through improvisation, denial, discipline, ritual, and necessity. But persistence can itself become a burden when each year brings a new form of strain. By the time plague enters the story, the 6th century is no longer merely enduring a mystery of the sky. It is enduring the cumulative consequences of a world repeatedly denied the chance to recover. So the plague does not replace the vanished sun as the age's defining terror. It completes it. The darkened skies of 536 and the years that follow may not explain the pandemic, but they help explain why the pandemic lands in a world so ready to suffer. Climate stress has thinned the margin. Scarcity has weakened bodies and systems. Repeated disruption has eroded resilience. Then plague arrives, and the centuries' earlier mysteries harden into mortality. A sun once described as moon-like now feels less like an omen than a beginning, the first visible sign of a decade in which the ordinary foundations of life would be shaken from sky to soil to flesh. It is tempting, looking back across the 6th century, to search for a phrase large enough to contain all of this suffering at once. That is how periods become known by dramatic labels. In recent years, one of the most repeated has been the claim that the years around 536 began the worst decade to be alive. The phrase is memorable, sharp, and almost designed for modern circulation. It captures something real about the convergence of atmospheric dimming, cooling, food stress, political strain, and plague. Yet it also risks simplifying a world that was uneven in its suffering and far more complicated than any slogan can hold. The mid-6th century may indeed rank among the harshest stretches of recorded human history, but to understand why, it helps to move more slowly than the phrase allows. The case for extraordinary hardship is strong. Around 536, the sky appears to dim across much of the northern hemisphere. Tree ring records suggest severe cooling. Ice cores preserve volcanic traces. Harvests likely suffer in multiple regions. The years that follow may bring additional eruptions and renewed climatic stress. Then, in the early 540s, plague enters the Mediterranean world and beyond, adding epidemic mortality to populations already thinned by scarcity and instability. Few decades offer such a compressed layering of environmental and biological crisis, What survives in the record suggests not one type of suffering, but several interacting at once, each amplifying the next. In that sense, the label is understandable. It points toward a sequence in which ordinary recovery keeps being interrupted, and yet the phrase becomes misleading when it pretends to universal certainty. There was no single 6th century human experience. The darkened skies did not affect every region equally. Not all communities starved. Not all societies were equally exposed to the plague. Some populations may have escaped the worst of one crisis only to face another. Others may have endured one blow with relative stability because of geography, storage, social structure, or simple luck. Scholars still debate how severe the cooling was in specific places, how far famine truly spread, and what mortality levels can responsibly be inferred from the surviving evidence. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for all the variation in suffering. A slogan can flatten that unevenness into false totality. Still, even with caution, the mid-6th century remains extraordinary. What makes it so severe is not just the intensity of individual events, but their timing and interaction. Hard decades can come from war alone, or from plague alone, or from a single great famine. The 6th century appears to offer a stacked crisis. Climate stress weakens food systems. Food stress weakens bodies and institutions. Repeated atmospheric shocks disrupt recovery. Plague then moves through that weakened landscape, not into a world of abundance and political ease, but into one already carrying the marks of exhaustion. When modern historians describe the era as one of the worst times to live, they are responding not only to isolated catastrophes, but to the sense of a whole system losing reliability at multiple levels. There is another reason the phrase resonates. It reflects a modern instinct to rank disasters, to compare historical suffering across centuries as though misery could be sorted like a list. But historical pain does not lend itself easily to hierarchy. Was it worse to live through the mid-6th century in a city struck by plague, or through a later century of invasion, or during a drought-driven collapse elsewhere, or inside the Black Death, or amid the violence of the 20th century? Such comparisons may satisfy curiosity, but they are rarely precise. They depend on what counts mortality, duration, geography, bodily suffering, political collapse, psychological uncertainty, or long-term demographic damage. The 6th century scores high on many of those measures, but not all can be quantified cleanly. What survives in the record suggests extremity, but not a neat ranking. What may be more useful is to think of the decade not as the worst in a competitive sense, but as one of the clearest examples of cumulative crisis in pre-modern history. It shows how several different vulnerabilities can align at once. A society can survive war. It can survive a run of bad harvests. It can survive epidemic disease. But when all these pressures overlap, and when the natural world itself has become less predictable, the effect is different. The world does not end in a single blow. It becomes harder to inhabit. People keep living, planting, trading, praying, fighting, and governing, but they do so with less margin, less trust in season, and less ability to absorb the next shock. This cumulative nature may explain why the 6th century feels so modern in a strange way. Modern people are familiar with the idea of systems failure, of overlapping crises that magnify each other, climate stress affecting food, disease spreading along trade routes, political institutions strained by shortages, public confidence weakened by environmental instability. The 6th century offers an ancient version of that pattern, though without modern science, media, or state capacity. The people enduring it do not know they are living through a compound crisis. They simply know that one form of distress keeps arriving before the last has lifted. That experiential structure, more than any superlative label, is what makes the period so haunting. There is also the matter of duration. One terrible event can scar a generation, but repeated crisis changes the baseline of life itself. Children born in the later 530s may grow up knowing only a world of unstable weather, tighter food, and then plague-haunted adulthood. Rulers coming of age in such a world make decisions from within it. Priests interpret suffering that has become prolonged rather than exceptional. Farmers recalibrate their expectations downward. The memory of normality begins to fade. A truly bad decade does not only kill, it teaches people to expect less from the future. Archaeology and historical demography remain cautious here, and rightly so. In some regions, the evidence for collapse is stronger than in others. Some settlements shrink, shift, or disappear. Elsewhere, continuity remains surprisingly robust. States endure where one might expect them to shatter. Trade contracts in some zones but persists in others. This unevenness is important because it resists melodrama. The mid-6th century is not a universal civilizational extinction event. It is a massive stress episode moving through a world of different ecologies and institutions. To call it one of the worst periods to live is reasonable. To call it uniformly apocalyptic everywhere is not. Yet even that restraint should not make the century seem moderate. There is a danger, especially in scholarly caution, of sanding away the human shock. A sun that loses brightness for months, repeated cold summers, probable harvest failure, rising scarcity, and then a plague pandemic. This is not ordinary historical roughness. It is a sustained assault on the foundations of daily life. The fact that some societies endured it does not make it mild. It makes human endurance remarkable. Survival under stacked crises is not evidence against severity. It is evidence of how much suffering communities can absorb before they finally break, and how often they go on living even after breakage has begun. The phrase worst decade also points toward another truth. The crisis of the 6th century was not only physical but cognitive. It confused explanation. People can endure a known enemy more easily than an unknown pattern. War has opponents. Taxation has collectors. Even plague, once visible, has symptoms and routines of fear. But the dimmed sun begins as a mystery above all politics. The cooling that follows feels at once global and local, obvious and unexplained. Then more hardship comes. Then plague. A decade becomes especially terrible when people cannot place its suffering into a single understandable cause. The 6th century forces people to live inside uncertainty as much as deprivation. Modern historians have therefore begun to treat the decade less as a curiosity and more as a central case study in how environmental shocks interact with human systems. That does not mean everyone agrees on the scale of each component. Some scholars are more skeptical about mortality totals or the degree of economic collapse. Others emphasize resilience and continuity over catastrophe. These debates are healthy, because they remind us that the past must be reconstructed from fragmentary evidence, not inherited whole. But debate itself has not reduced the importance of the period. If anything, it has sharpened it. The more closely the evidence is tested, the clearer it becomes that the years after 536 deserve their grim reputation, even if the exact phrasing remains open to argument. Perhaps the best way to understand the decade is this. It was one of those rare stretches in which many of the things a society relies on at once became less dependable. Sunlight, season, harvest, food reserve, bodily strength, public order, and demographic continuity all came under pressure, not everywhere equally, not always in the same sequence, not with the same outcome, but enough, and widely enough, that later centuries would inherit both the traces of the damage and the puzzle of its cause. The era earns its dark reputation not because it can be crowned the single worst time in human history with mathematical certainty, but because it so clearly reveals what happens when several basic systems fail together. So the phrase survives because it is crude but not empty. It overstates in order to point. It compresses a decade into a verdict. Scholars may rightly object to its lack of precision, yet they also understand why it persists. The mid-6th century feels like a decade when the world became harder in almost every direction at once. The sun dimmed, the climate lurched, food tightened, plague followed, empires endured, but with greater strain, community survived, but often more weakly. And if the phrase "the worst decade to be alive" remains too blunt to satisfy the historian entirely, it still captures a truth the evidence keeps returning to for many people across much of the known world. These were years when the ordinary promises of life were broken one after another, until survival itself began to look like a kind of victory. Long after the skies of the 6th century clear, the possibility remains that something of those darkened years continues to live on, not in ice or wood this time, but in story. This is where the mystery of 536 becomes both more alluring and more difficult. Physical evidence can show that the atmosphere changed. Written sources can show that people noticed. But can a climatic catastrophe survive in cultural memory long enough to become myth? Can a generation that lives through dimmed suns, failed summers, and hunger past some distorted echo of that experience into legend, ritual, or apocalyptic imagination? Scholars have asked these questions with growing interest, especially in Northern Europe, where the later mythic record contains images of prolonged winter, failing light, and a world unsettled before disaster. The possibility is tantalizing. The proof is much harder. The most famous comparison centers on the Norse idea of Fimbulwinter, the great winter said in later medieval texts to precede Ragnarok, the world-ending crisis in which order collapses, the sun is darkened, and the gods themselves are drawn toward destruction. It is easy to see why historians and archaeologists have lingered over this, a memory of severe climatic stress in the 6th century, preserved across generations and eventually transformed into mythic language, would make intuitive sense. Northern Europe may have been especially vulnerable to cooling and harvest failure. Archaeological evidence from Scandinavia suggests disruptions in some regions around this period, including settlement changes, stress, and possibly ritual responses. A long, terrible winter entering legend does not seem impossible, and yet possibility is not the same as certainty. The surviving Norse texts are written down centuries after the 6th century, in Christianized medieval Iceland, after long processes of oral transmission, recomposition, and literary shaping. Myths are not diaries. They gather layers, absorb older motifs, and respond to the needs of the societies that tell them. Fimbulwinter may preserve a dim cultural echo of real environmental trauma, but it may also draw on broader northern experience of hard winters, on Indo-European mythic patterns, or on narrative needs unrelated to any single historical event. Scholars still debate this intensely. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for how myth carries memory across such vast spans of time. Still, the comparison is not frivolous. One reason it remains attractive is that cultural memory often preserves atmosphere rather than chronology. People may forget exact dates, causes, and sequences while retaining the emotional shape of a catastrophe, a period in which light failed, cold deepened, and ordinary confidence in season collapsed could easily harden into a later image of a world-threatening winter. Oral tradition does not preserve the 6th century as a calendar entry. It might preserve it as a feeling, the sense that the cosmos once became hostile, that the sun once weakened, that human order once trembled before something larger. In that sense, myth can carry truth without carrying facts in the modern sense. There are material hints that make the Northern question more than literary speculation. In parts of Scandinavia, the decades around the mid-6th century appear to coincide with significant social change. Some settlements were abandoned or reorganized. In certain areas, archaeologists have noted shifts that may reflect demographic loss or altered land use. There's also evidence of elite deposition and ritual activity that some scholars interpret as responses to crisis. Most famous are the large numbers of gold brateets and other prestige objects deposited in parts of the north during the migration period. Some have wondered whether such acts reflect attempts to restore cosmic order, appease supernatural forces, or respond to the kind of atmospheric disaster that made the sun itself seem damaged. But caution is essential. Ritual deposition is not a straightforward weather report. Gold offerings may relate to political competition, religious practice, social signaling, inheritance, or many other factors. Settlement change can come from conflict, migration, internal restructuring, or ecological pressure in combinations that remain hard to untangle. The temptation to line up every 6th century northern anomaly with a climatic crisis is understandable, but too neat. What survives in the record suggests stress, perhaps severe stress, but not a single interpretable script. The North may indeed remember the darkened years in story and ritual, but the route from climate event to mythic text is anything but direct. Beyond Scandinavia, there are other cultural traditions that may preserve impressions of unusual darkness, failed seasons, or cosmic disorder. Apocalyptic thinking flourishes readily in periods of instability, and the 6th century is no stranger to eschatological imagination. In Christian contexts, atmospheric anomalies, famine, war, and plague can all be read against the expectation of divine judgment or the nearing end of the age. That does not mean every apocalyptic text from the period is a direct response to 536. Human societies are perfectly capable of imagining the end of the world without volcanic aerosols. But when a real environmental catastrophe arrives, it gives old symbolic languages new force. The sun darkening is not merely a metaphor when the sun really has begun to lose its brightness. This interplay between event and symbol is one of the most important aspects of cultural memory. Catastrophes do not remain purely physical. They are processed through the moral and cosmological systems already available. A dimmed sky in the 6th century may become, in one region, a sign of divine displeasure, in another, a story of cosmic winter, in another, a ritual crisis requiring offerings, in another, a simple but unforgettable family memory of hunger that later generations inherit as caution rather than myth. There is no reason to expect one uniform memory tradition. Different societies metabolize the same shock differently. The challenge for historians is that cultural memory is both durable and slippery. It can outlast institutions, but it does so by changing form. A society may preserve the fact that something terrible happened without preserving what modern researchers most want to know: when, why, and how exactly. That is why the northern myths remain so fascinating. They seem to offer a bridge between lived catastrophe and later storytelling, yet the bridge is covered in mist. It can be walked imaginatively, but only with care. Scholars who are too skeptical risk missing genuine deep memory. Scholars who are too eager risk turning every poetic winter into a coded reference to 536. There is also the question of scale. If the 6th century atmospheric crisis affected large parts of the Northern Hemisphere, why do some cultural memories appear so faint? Part of the answer is simply that memory is selective. Communities remember what later circumstances allow them to remember. Oral traditions survive where they are cultivated. Written texts survive where they are copied. Entire populations may experience disaster and leave behind almost no recoverable cultural trace. This is one of history's cruelties. Suffering is not automatically remembered. Sometimes glaciers remember better than descendants do. Yet in another sense, the 6th century may be remembered more widely than it first appears, not through explicit stories of dimmed suns, but through a general thickening of apocalyptic, penitential, or cosmic disorder language in the generations that follow. Again, one must be careful. Religious and mythic systems have their own momentum. Not every dark symbol belongs to one atmospheric event. Still, it is not unreasonable to think that real catastrophe lends force to old fears. A people already familiar with myths of ending may hear them differently after the sky itself has misbehaved. One of the quieter possibilities is that the memory of 536 survived not mainly in grand myth, but in altered behaviour. Communities that endured severe climatic stress might change settlement patterns, storage habits, ritual priorities, or political arrangements in ways that outlasted explicit explanation. A later generation may not know why a certain offering tradition intensified, why a landscape was abandoned, or why local stories warned of failed summers. Cultural memory is often embodied before it is narrated. It can live in practice as much as in text. This matters because it reminds us that the vanished sun did not pass only through atmosphere and agriculture. It also passed through imagination. Once the ordinary order of light and season breaks, people do not simply note the change and move on. They fit it into the stories by which the world becomes intelligible. Some of those stories harden into chronicles. Some dissolve into silence. Some may survive, transformed beyond direct recognition. In myths later written down under entirely different historical conditions. The evidence will probably never allow certainty here. Scholars still debate too many links in the chain, and the record is too fragmentary to close the matter, but the possibility itself is revealing. The event of 536 feels large enough, and strange enough, that it seems reasonable to look for its afterlife not only in chemistry and tree growth, but in the human need to tell stories about a world that once became untrustworthy. So the darkened years may have left two kinds of memory. One is physical, cold and precise sulfate in ice, narrow growth in wood, traces in the earth. The other is human uncertain, adaptive, poetic, and perhaps still half hidden in traditions of winter, omens, endings, and cosmic unease. The first memory proves the event. The second, if it exists in the ways some scholars suspect, proves something equally important. It shows that catastrophe does not end when the sky clears. It lingers in imagination, where history and myth sometimes meet without ever fully agreeing on what they saw. Even in a damaged century, people do not spend every day collapsing. They adapt. That is one of the least dramatic truths in history, and one of the most important. Catastrophe invites attention because it is sudden, visible, and narratively satisfying. Survival is quieter. It happens in repeated acts of adjustment so ordinary that the record often barely notices them. Yet the 6th century, for all its dimmed skies, failed harvests, and plague, is also a story of communities refusing to disappear. They move, store, ration, improvise, endure, and sometimes reinvent the terms on which life can continue. If the vanished sun revealed how fragile ancient societies were, it also revealed how stubborn they could be. Adaptation begins at the smallest scale, in households that rework the arithmetic of daily life. A family facing poor harvests may reduce consumption, diversify food sources, slaughter livestock earlier than planned, preserve seed with greater discipline, or rely more heavily on fishing, foraging, or exchange with kin. None of these responses is glamorous. All of them are costly. Slaughtering animals may preserve life in the present while damaging future recovery. Eating seed grain may solve one winter and ruin the next spring. Gathering wild foods may mean longer labour for lower return. Yet these are the choices by which survival is assembled. What survives in the record suggests that communities across the 6th century world did not simply wait helplessly for the sky to improve. They worked around its failure as best they could, even when every workaround carried a price. At the village level, adaptation often means collective negotiation. Scarcity changes the value of cooperation, shared labour, pooled storage, informal credit, and reciprocal obligation become more important when the ordinary margin is gone. In many pre-modern societies, the line between survival and collapse runs not only through ecology, but through social trust. A bad year can be survived if those with reserves lend or share, if local leaders distribute pressure tolerably. If people believe there will still be a community on the other side of the crisis, when that trust fails, the same climatic shock becomes much deadlier. Historians rarely get direct access to such local dynamics, because the archive favours elites and institutions. But no serious reading of famine or environmental stress can ignore them. The difference between dearth and disaster is often social before it is numerical. Some communities adapt by moving. Migration does not always take the form of dramatic population collapse or mass wandering. Often it is incremental marginal land abandoned, upland grazing rethought, households joining stronger settlements, communities shifting towards zones with better access to water, fisheries, trade, or protection. Archaeology from parts of Europe suggests that the 6th century sees settlement change in some regions, though the causes are not always clear and never reducible to climate alone. Scholars still debate how much movement can be tied directly to the atmospheric and agricultural shocks of the period. The evidence remains incomplete, yet what survives in the record suggests that environmental stress often presses hardest on marginal landscapes first, and those margins are where shifts in occupation, land use, and local population become most likely. This is especially true in colder or more climatically sensitive regions. In northern zones or in upland environments with already short growing seasons, a series of poor summers can force difficult decisions quickly. Communities may consolidate onto better land. Some farmsteads may be abandoned. Political centres may shift as local elites lose the capacity to support dependence in the old way. None of this needs to be total to be historically significant. A society does not have to vanish for its geography of survival to change. One of the quiet lessons of the 6th century is that continuity often survives through rearrangement. Landscapes remain inhabited, but not always by the same people, in the same density, with the same priorities. States and large institutions adapt too, though often less gracefully. Empires can redistribute grain, suspend or adjust taxes, move troops, reorganize transport, and rely on elite patronage or ecclesiastical charity to stabilize stressed populations. In practice, these responses are uneven and often compromised by the same shortages they are trying to address. Still, it would be wrong to imagine ancient states as simply rigid machines marching toward breakdown. The Byzantine Empire, for example, continues to govern, provision, legislate, and fight even after repeated environmental and epidemiological shocks. That does not mean it is unaffected, it means adaptation and strain coexist. Officials improvise within systems built for other conditions. Some measures work briefly, others intensify local resentment. Administrative endurance is itself a kind of survival strategy, though one often paid for by those lowest in the hierarchy. Religious institutions also become crucial in periods of prolonged instability. Monasteries, churches, temples, and other sacred centers are not only places of prayer, they are storehouses, social anchors, and mechanisms for distributing charity or moral order. In times of scarcity and disease, they may absorb the displaced, feed the hungry, interpret suffering, and reinforce communal obligations that purely political institutions struggle to uphold. Of course, religious institutions are not immune to scarcity. Their wealth varies, their motives are mixed, and their own communities can be struck by famine and plague. Yet what survives in the record suggests that sacred institutions often become central to survival, precisely because they mediate between material need and meaning. They help people endure not only by providing bread, but by making a broken world still seem inhabitable. There are also environmental adaptations that may leave only faint traces. Farmers may shift crop emphasis toward hardier grains. Pastoral communities may alter herd composition. Storage strategies may become more conservative after repeated bad years. Trade may increasingly prioritize staple security over luxury movement in some places. Forest use, fishing pressure, or reliance on secondary food sources may rise. These adjustments are difficult to reconstruct in detail, and archaeologists are rightly cautious about overreading limited evidence. But survival across a wounded decade almost certainly depended on innumerable small ecological decisions. A world of rigid habits would not have made it through the 6th century at all. The problem, of course, is that adaptation itself can deepen inequality. Communities with access to good land, strong leadership, diversified subsistence, or robust trade connections can adjust more successfully than those without them. Elites may preserve status by shifting burdens downward. Towns with storehouses may outlast scattered farmsteads. Coastal zones with fisheries may endure better than inland grain-dependent regions in some circumstances. Mobile groups may exploit opportunities that more fixed societies cannot. Crisis does not simply divide survivors from victims, it redistributes advantage. The 6th century likely sharpened existing inequalities, allowing some communities to endure precisely because others bore a disproportionate share of the cost. This uneven survival helps explain why the period produces both signs of hardship and signs of continuity. Some settlements shrink while others endure. Some political systems harden while others fragment. Some elites lose power while others reassert it through redistribution, piety, or military control. This complexity matters because it prevents the story from becoming a simple morality tale of collapse. What survives in the record suggests a world under severe stress, but not a world without agency. People make choices within narrowing limits. Some of those choices preserve life, some preserve hierarchy more than life. Often they do both at once. There is a psychological adaptation as well. After repeated atmospheric shocks, hunger, and plague, normality itself changes. People begin to expect less from seasons, less from governments, less from the future. This is not surrender exactly, it is recalibration. A household that has learned the fragility of harvest may store more aggressively if it can. A ruler who has seen how quickly cities can weaken may govern more harshly or more cautiously. A religious community may intensify penitential or protective practices. A culture shaped by repeated stress develops habits fitted to uncertainty. These habits are difficult to measure, but they matter historically because they alter what later societies treat as ordinary risk. One reason the 6th century remains so haunting is that so much of this survival is nearly invisible. Chronicles record dim suns and plague outbreaks more readily than they record successful rationing or the quiet decision to relocate a settlement half a valley over. Archaeology can sometimes glimpse these shifts, but rarely with emotional clarity. The archive is biased towards spectacle, while endurance hides in routine. And yet routine is where history survives itself. A generation lives through the weakening of the sun not only by fearing it, but by continuing to sow, mend, barter, bury, rebuild, and tell children what signs to watch for in an untrustworthy season. This does not mean resilience should be romanticized. To praise survival too readily is to risk ignoring its cost. Communities that endure catastrophe are often permanently altered by it. They may emerge smaller, poorer, more unequal, more rigid, more suspicious, and more deeply scarred. Endurance is not recovery. It is continuation under damage. The 6th century survivors do not step back into the world as it was before 536. They step into a different world, one in which climate has proven unstable, food less reliable, disease more terrifying, and old assurances less secure. Their success lies not in restoring the past exactly, but in learning how to live after its promises have failed. And that, perhaps, is the deepest counterpoint to the vanished sun. The mystery of 536 is often framed as a story of darkness, and rightly so. But darkness alone does not explain what followed. What followed was adaptation under pressure, a long negotiation between broken systems and human persistence. Fields were replanted, networks were rerouted, communities were thinned but not erased, faith was intensified, power was redistributed, landscapes changed. The world beneath the dimmed sky did not stop. It narrowed, hardened, shifted, and in doing so revealed something as important as catastrophe itself, that survival in history is rarely clean, rarely noble, and rarely visible. But it is often the force that decides what remains when the darkness finally begins to lift. Even after ice cores, tree rings, and reread chronicles have transformed 536 from an atmospheric rumour into a historical event. The mystery remains stubbornly unfinished, in some ways. Modern scholarship has made the puzzle sharper rather than smaller. We can say with much greater confidence that the sky truly changed, that the growing seasons faltered, and that volcanic aerosols are the leading explanation for the dimmed sun. But confidence at one level has only revealed uncertainty at another. The closer historians and scientists come to the mechanism, the more they encounter unresolved questions about source, sequence, scale, and consequence. The vanished sun is no longer a legend. It is now a well-grounded mystery, and that may be why it continues to fascinate. The first great uncertainty is the source of the initial event. A major volcanic eruption remains the strongest explanation by far, but which volcano actually triggered the atmospheric veil of 536 is still debated. Iceland has long been a leading candidate in public imagination, and for understandable reasons. A northern eruption fits some aspects of the ice core evidence, and it offers a plausible route for rapid climatic effects over Europe and the North Atlantic. Yet plausibility is not final identification. Other researchers have argued for a tropical source, noting that tropical eruptions can spread aerosols widely through the stratosphere and influence both hemispheres. Still others suspect that the evidence points not to one clean culprit, but to an unresolved set of volcanic events whose exact origins remain difficult to pin down with certainty. This difficulty is not a failure of science so much as a reminder of what volcanic history looks like after 15 centuries. Eruptions leave traces, but traces decay, disperse, and require interpretation. Sulfate in an ice core proves that volcanic material entered the atmosphere. But sulfate alone does not come labelled with a mountain's name. Microscopic volcanic glass, when found and chemically matched, can provide a more specific fingerprint. Yet such matches are technically demanding and not always possible. Even when a likely source is proposed, other scholars may question the dating, the distribution of ash, or the chemical fit. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for every part of the current dataset. That is why the source question remains open, not because researchers know nothing, but because they know enough to understand how careful they must be. Then there is the problem of chronology. Did one eruption in 536 cause the dimming and initial cooling, followed by a second major eruption, around 540 or 541 that renewed the stress? That clustered model is increasingly persuasive, but the exact spacing, regional timing, and relative severity of those shocks are still under discussion. Ancient texts rarely offer the kind of precise meteorological chronology modern analysts would love to have. Natural archives provide powerful signals, but aligning them exactly with human experience is not always straightforward. A sulfate spike does not tell us on its own which month the light first looked wrong in Italy, or how quickly cooling reached a farming district in Gaul. Historians therefore work in an uneasy but productive space between annual or near-annual scientific resolution and much more fragmentary human testimony. A third unresolved question concerns geography. How global was the event in lived terms? The strongest evidence points to widespread effects across much of the Northern Hemisphere, with written witnesses from the Mediterranean and East Asia, and natural proxies showing broad climatic stress. But widespread is not the same as uniform. Some regions may have experienced severe dimming and cooling. Others may have seen more moderate anomalies. Some localities may have been devastated agriculturally, while others suffered little beyond a strange sky and a poor season. Scholars still debate these regional gradients because large-scale climate forcing always meets local ecology, topography, crop systems, and weather variability in unpredictable ways. One of the hardest tasks in studying 536 is resisting the temptation to turn a hemispheric event into a single, standardized human experience. The mortality question is even more difficult. How many people actually died because of the climatic crisis itself, apart from the later plague? Here the silence of the sources becomes almost unbearable. Ancient authors notice darkness, cold, and famine, but rarely in ways that allow demographic calculation. Archaeology can hint at stress, abandonment, or altered burial practice, but it does not usually translate cleanly into death counts. Some modern discussions drift toward dramatic estimates that sound satisfying but rest on fragile foundations. Serious scholars are more cautious. What survives in the record suggests real suffering, scarcity, and probable famine in some regions, but not a mortality figure that can be stated confidently across the wider affected world. This uncertainty matters. A mystery should not be solved by exaggeration merely because the event itself is dramatic enough to invite it. The same caution applies to the relationship between climate and plague. It is tempting to draw a straight line, volcanoes dim the sun, Cooling ruins harvests, hunger weakens bodies, plague then ravages an enfeebled population. That chain contains elements of truth, but it risks being too clean. The Justinianic plague had its own ecology, its own vectors, and its own pathways of spread. Climate stress likely mattered in shaping vulnerability, and perhaps in altering some of the conditions under which disease moved. Yet scholars still debate exactly how strong or direct that connection was. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the pandemic's timing, recurrence, or regional differences. The age is a compound crisis, but compound does not mean mechanically linked in every detail. There is also debate over consequences. Did 536 and the crises that followed fundamentally transform the world order of late antiquity, or did they merely intensify transitions already underway? This is one of the largest historical questions in the field. Some scholars emphasize rupture. They see the mid-6th century as a major turning point, one that deepened economic contraction, weakened imperial systems, and helped reshape the map of the post-Roman and Eastern Mediterranean worlds. Others stress continuity and resilience. They point out that the Byzantine Empire survived, that many communities adapted, that some regions maintained trade and governance, and that not every late antique transformation can be laid at the feet of volcanic aerosols. Both perspectives contain truth. The vanished sun was clearly consequential, but how consequential remains a matter of scale, comparison, and interpretive philosophy. This is where modern fascination sometimes outruns the evidence. Popular retellings love tidy endings. One volcano caused the Dark Age. One catastrophe broke the ancient world. One terrible year explains everything that came after, but history resists that kind of compression. The 6th century was already politically unstable in many regions. War, fiscal strain, mobility, religious conflict, and long-term transformations in the Roman world were underway before the skies dimmed. The environmental shock did not create history from nothing. It entered a moving system and changed its direction, speed, and stress points. That makes it no less important. In fact, it may make it more important, because real historical turning points rarely act alone. Another lingering question is how far cultural memory stretches. Did later myths of cosmic winter preserve some real memory of 6th century trauma, especially in the north? The possibility remains compelling, but the proof is elusive. Scholars still debate whether the resemblance between later mythic motifs and 6th century climate disaster is meaningful inheritance or coincidental pattern. This uncertainty is not a weakness of the field. It is a reminder that human memory changes what it preserves. Some catastrophes remain vivid in story, others survive only in altered ritual, settlement habits, or vague images of disorder. 536 may have left both physical memory and cultural afterimages, but exactly how those afterimages move through time remains unresolved. Perhaps the deepest unanswered question is not about volcanoes or chronicles at all. It is about lived experience. What did it feel like, week after week, to inhabit a year in which the sun kept rising but did not seem fully alive? What did it mean to realize that the season could no longer be trusted, that the harvest might fail, not because of one storm or one local pest, but because the sky itself had become wrong? Science can tell us about aerosols and cooling. History can recover prices, wars, and plague, but neither can completely restore the texture of daily uncertainty. That gap between mechanism and sensation is part of what keeps the mystery unsettled. We know more than ever about what happened in 536. We still cannot entirely know what it was like. And yet the very incompleteness of the evidence may be what makes the event so enduringly powerful. Some historical mysteries persist because nothing solid can be known. This one persists because so much can be known and still not enough. We have the dim sun of the chroniclers, the cold wood of the trees, the chemical scars in the ice, the food stress, the political fragility, the plague that follows, the myths that may or may not remember any of it. The outline is there, clear enough to command respect, blurred enough to resist closure. The 6th century does not hand over its secrets all at once. It gives us pieces, and the pieces fit just well enough to reveal how much remains missing. So the modern scholar stands in an oddly ancient position. Like the people of 536, only in a far safer form, we're also looking up at a changed sky and trying to understand what lies behind it. We have better tools, stronger evidence, and wider perspective. But we still live with partial sight. The vanished sun has been explained, but not completely. The mystery has narrowed, but not disappeared, and perhaps that is fitting. An event that dimmed the world without extinguishing it has left behind an explanation of the same kind, illuminating, persuasive, and still shadowed at the edges. Eventually the sky does recover. That may be the strangest part of the whole story. After all the dimness, all the blunted daylight, all the cold growing seasons and tightened reserves and years of layered strain, the sun returns to something like its old authority. Morning begins to look like morning again. Light sharpens, warmth gathers more reliably in stone, soil, and skin. The atmosphere clears enough that the world no longer appears veiled from above, yet by the time brightness returns, the deeper damage has already spread through landscapes and societies in ways that cannot simply be reversed by a clearer season. The mystery of 536 endures because the sky brightened while the consequences kept unfolding. This is one of the defining characteristics of environmental catastrophe. The physical trigger may be brief or at least bounded. The human afterlife is not. A volcanic veil can thin. Sulfate aerosols can settle. Temperatures can recover toward more familiar norms. But lost harvests are not restored retroactively. Malnutrition does not vanish because the next summer is warmer. Herds cannot be rebuilt in a single season. Political confidence does not snap back the moment the sun looks healthy again. A plague pandemic, once set in motion, does not care that the atmosphere is cleared. Recovery in history is never a simple reversal of disaster. It is a separate process. Slower, patchier, and often less visible than collapse itself. For the people living through the later 540s and beyond, the return of ordinary light would not have felt like a neat conclusion. It may have brought relief. Certainly. Fields under a more dependable sun promise a kind of hope that a dimmed world cannot. But hope arrives inside altered conditions. Communities have been thinned. Some villages have shrunk or moved. Some estates have changed hands. Some cities are poorer in people and capacity. Some institutions have survived only by becoming harsher. Children have grown up in scarcity. Adults have learned not to trust the season too easily. The skies may brighten, but the social and bodily memory of instability remains. This is why 536 matters not only as an event but as an inflection. The year itself is famous because it gives the mystery a memorable beginning, a date attached to a broken sun. But the historical significance lies in what follows. The dimming opens a period in which late antique societies are exposed to how dependent they are on environmental regularity. It reveals the fragility beneath imperial ambition, beneath long-distance trade, beneath local farming knowledge. beneath the assumption that the future will resemble the recent past. Once that assumption is broken, even temporarily, history changes its tone. The world becomes less secure in ways that endure long after the physical sign in the sky has faded. In the Byzantine world, that altered tone is visible in the narrowing gap between imperial claim and material reality. Justinian's empire survives, and that survival matters. It remains a formidable state, capable of administration, war, theological influence, and extraordinary cultural production. Yet survival under strain is not the same as untouched continuity. The resources available to sustain restoration grow more constrained. Plague and environmental stress reshape what the empire can demand and what provinces can provide. Ambition remains, but it operates in a world made thinner. The age of monumental confidence gives way, gradually, to an age more defined by endurance. Across Europe and the wider Near East, the same pattern appears in different forms. Some regions adapt and continue with modified structures. Others fragment more visibly. Political forms shift, but not because one mysterious year single-handedly destroys the old world. Rather, 536 and the crises clustered around it accelerate, deepen, or expose transformations already in motion. This is one reason the year remains unsolved in the fullest sense. Scholars can identify likely causes for the dimming, but the meaning of the event depends on how one understands change itself. Was 536 the start of a darker age, the sharpest turn in a longer transition, or one terrible shock among several shaping the 6th century historians still debate the proportions? The evidence supports significance, but not simplification. And perhaps that is exactly why the year continues to hold the imagination. If a single eruption could be identified beyond all doubt, if every local consequence could be mapped neatly, if mortality could be counted and causation reduced to a clean chain, then 536 would still be important, but it would no longer feel uncanny. Instead, it remains poised between clarity and shadow. We know the sky dimmed, we know climates shifted, we know harvests suffered and plague followed in a battered world. Yet no final sentence closes the matter. There is always another question at the edge of the evidence, another region whose experience is unclear, another possible source volcano, another reminder that human beings lived through something vast without ever fully understanding it. The surviving image at the center of the whole story is still the simplest one, a sun that shines without brightness. It is memorable because it captures both the event and its legacy. The sun is there, but altered. Civilization is there, but altered. The world continues, but in a diminished key, even after the skies recover. The phrase lingers because it describes more than atmospheric haze. It describes a century in which the basic supports of life became visibly unreliable. Light, warmth, food, health, order, continuity, none vanished entirely, but none remained what they had been. The 6th century learned that history does not need total darkness to become dangerous. Partial failure is enough. There is also a warning hidden inside the event's legacy. The people of 536 did not know why the sky had changed. They had no instruments to track aerosols, no global data, no laboratory means of identifying volcanic signatures in the ice. They were forced to endure the consequences before they could even name the mechanism. Modern people, by contrast, can often see environmental stress coming more clearly. Yet that clarity does not necessarily guarantee wisdom. One reason 536 has become so compelling in recent years is that it speaks to a familiar anxiety, how quickly large societies can discover that they depend on stable systems they barely notice, until those systems fail. In that sense, the vanished sun is not only an ancient puzzle, it is a mirror held up to every civilization that mistakes routine stability for permanence. Still, for all its resonance, the story belongs first to the people who lived beneath that dim sky without the comfort of explanation. Farmers watching grain fail beneath a pale summer, monks recording a sun that looked wrong, officials trying to manage shortages with inadequate tools, households recalculating meals in fear, port cities facing plague after years of strain, children growing into adulthood inside a world that had become less generous and less predictable. The year 536 survives because they noticed something true: the light had changed, and once the light changed, everything below it began to feel less certain. So the sun returns, but the mystery stays. It stays in ice cores and chronicles, in narrow tree rings and disputed volcanoes, in later myths of winter, and in modern arguments over scale and consequence. It stays because 536 is not just a problem of cause, it is a problem of memory. How does history remember an event that was visible everywhere and understood nowhere in full? How does a civilization record a sky that failed it without knowing what had happened above the horizon? The answer, imperfect and haunting, is that it remembers in fragments: a pale sun, a cold summer, a failed harvest, a plague-ridden decade, a century that continued but changed. And that is where the mystery finally settles, not in proving that the sun literally disappeared, because it did not, but in recognizing how close a civilization can come to feeling that it has. In 536 daylight remained, yet confidence drained out of it. Warmth returned, yet too late for many. The heavens recovered, but the world below had already been marked. That mark is the true legacy of the vanished sun, not darkness without end, but the revelation that even the oldest certainties can thin, and that once they do, history moves differently beneath their weakened light. The wind down begins where the story began, with people looking up, not because they expect an answer from the sky, but because for a brief and terrible stretch of years the sky stopped feeling neutral. It became part of the story. A pale sun hung over fields, cities, harbours, monasteries, and roads, and everyone beneath it had to keep living anyway. That may be the most human detail of all. The world did not pause. Bread still had to be baked. Children still had to be fed. Seeds still had to be chosen. The dead still had to be buried. History, even at its darkest, keeps moving in the small tasks of ordinary people. And perhaps that is why 536 lingers so powerfully across 15 centuries. Not because it offers one perfect answer, but because it leaves behind an image so simple and so unsettling that it never fully loosens its hold. A sun without brightness, a summer without warmth, a world still intact, yet somehow reduced. The old order does not vanish in a single crash. It dims. Confidence dims with it. Then memory takes over, carrying forward not a complete explanation, but a feeling that something immense once passed overhead and changed the terms of life below. The ice remembers, the trees remember, a few written lines remember, maybe even myth remembers, in its own distorted way. And between those fragments, the shape of the event remains visible enough to trouble the imagination. There was a year when the light thinned, and what followed was not the end of the world, but something more intimate and more recognizable, a lesson in fragility. Civilizations rest on patterns so deep they feel eternal, until suddenly they do not. By the time the sky clears, people are already different. Their governments are different. Their landscapes are different. Their fears are different. The brightness returns, but innocence does not. What remains is endurance, and the long quiet work of rebuilding life under a sun that has resumed its old place, though never again seeming quite as unquestionable as before. Far out beyond any one empire, the planet continues its own immense cycles, indifferent and exacting. Mountains erupt, aerosols drift, seasons bend. Human beings name these moments only afterward, and never completely. Yet for a little while in the 6th century, the distance between cosmic process and daily bread became frighteningly small. That is the final image the year leaves behind, not apocalypse, but proximity. The sense that the fate of fields and cities can turn on forces no ruler commands and no witness fully understands. And so the story ends where many mysteries end, not with total closure, but with a lingering horizon. Somewhere in the past, a dim sun rises over a waking world. People step outside. They pause. The light is wrong. They do not yet know how much will follow from that single recognition. They only know that morning has arrived, and yet not truly arrived. The day is here, but altered, and history, under that pale and wounded sky, is about to become something else.